Okay, good. Wow, that was lucky. I realized I hadn't checked my mic levels beforehand. They're fine. Good morning. Welcome to my channel, everyone. My name is Dr. Rachel Tapman, and this channel is for anyone who cares about language technology and other people. Stop trying to make that happen, Edge. It's never going to happen. I only use Uberstream. Hello, and welcome to Coffee Chat, where we talk about stuff from roughly the past week. As always, we got a couple categories we're going to cover. We're going to start with research. I know last week was super research heavy. This week is going to be much less research heavy, but it's going to be very heavy in terms of just like practical stuff that might be relevant to you and your work. And then we're going to talk about politics, so things like legislation, court cases, news about government stuff generally. Ethics, so, ethics and machine learning, broadly defined, instances of, very ethical or very unethical behavior. And then finally, just a little fun miscellaneous at the end, little palate cleanser, end on a high note, because sometimes stuff can get a little heavy. All right, let's hop right in. So I've started putting sorghum in my coffee, and it's match made in heaven. It's so good. I love sorghum. Anyway, it's a backtrack about what that was and those words I just said. Sorghum's a grain, but you can also use the cane like you can sugar cane, and it's much more drought resistant and tolerant. It's a very traditional Southern food, sorghum molasses. So I've been putting it in my coffee. I don't know why it didn't occur to me earlier. I usually have it in my pantry. Okay, moving on. Starting off with a paper from NACL, which was last week, by Zadik. I'm pretty sure, I'm 99% sure that it's the correct pronunciation. I've talked to him a lot. Language is hard, as it turns out, and a bunch of co-authors on the machine learning of ethical judgments from natural language. Basically the core idea of the paper is that we shouldn't do that, right? That you cannot automate ethical decisions, which I'm 100% on board with, and I think will come up later on today with some other things that are going on in the world that we're going to talk about during the coffee chat. So really great paper, strong position paper. I think it's super well argued. Here's why not to do this. And I'll just pop this link in the chat in case y'all want to read it. I would highly recommend it. Great paper. And as a reminder, it's on that side. I have my coffee, and if you support me monthly, at least $1, you get all the links for this all prettied up and organized every week. And this week I did it yesterday. I was ahead of the curve. I'm very proud of myself. So if you're a links please tier member on my coffee, you've already got them. All right, moving on. Hello, Multi-Solution. Good to see you. Next paper. This is a fun one. So those of you who have, read my work from when I was actively doing research may already know this, but I imagine most of you don't. But one of the things that I was really interested in grad school and still am is spelling variation. So how things are spelled differently intentionally, right? So almost no spelling error happens truly randomly, right? You don't insert truly random characters into the middle of a word, for example. You'll generally insert characters that are next to each other on the keyboard, or that are a very common to type little snippet. Or, in English, a lot of spelling errors are picking the wrong vowel letter to represent the schwa sound, that sort of sound that shows up a lot in English. And one thing that you can do with spelling variation is you can reflect your understanding of regional variation in language. So a really good example of this is that that old comic about the possum who lives in the swamp down in Louisiana. that I'm completely blanking on the name of right now. It's an old American comic. If you're familiar with it, I think most people probably aren't. It was, I think, fairly regional, but all the characters use really strongly written varieties of language that are really strongly representative of the language variety that these animals are supposed to speak. Or if you've ever read Pygmalion. So Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw is the play upon which My Fair Lady is based. It may be a short story. Anyway, I read it a while ago. The first bit is written in a very close phonetic transcription that's trying to like very closely mimic the sounds of language, and then got bored and stopped doing it because it was very difficult and very time consuming and also hard to read. But in that way, they're using, you know, variation in the way a word's spelled to show underlying variation in pronunciation. And that's something that I studied in grad school, particularly looking at Twitter data and American vowels and how speakers of different dialects and people who are imitating speakers of different dialects will use those vowels, and the degree to which the use of that written orthography correlates with the spoken language use. And this paper, just gonna roll it all the way back, is actually part of a special issue that is looking at like a bunch of different stuff around this general topic in French. And this one is looking at the degree to which different vowel shifts are being represented. French vowel shifts are being represented in tweets in French from 2011 to 2017. So just a really cool use of Twitter technology, a really cool use of Twitter data. I'm not as familiar with the sociolinguistics of French, so I'm not entirely sure, you know, I don't know a whole lot about these sociolinguistic variables, but one thing that I thought was particularly interesting in this paper is the use of, you know, sort of orthographic highlighting of those particular misspellings to be like, I meant to do this and here's how you know. So, you know, they'll be repeated. So like avant, where like the O is repeated a bunch, or a capitalization, so AVONT. Yeah, so interesting study. This whole special issue looks good. Thought it was cool. Something I like. All right, also in this sort of research topic, this is not a paper, but the NeurIPS research workshops have been announced. So if you're not familiar with the way that sort of workshops work at certainly machine learning and computer science related conferences, people will propose a workshop and they'll be like, hey, we should have a bunch of papers on this specific topic. And then they apply to different conferences and, you know, they may or may not get accepted. And some of the big workshops usually are accepted and usually repeat every year, but some of them don't. And sometimes you'll be like, why wasn't that workshop, you know, held last year? It's like, well, it didn't get accepted, or, you know, the organizers had other things to do. Here are the accepted workshops, and some of them are going to be in person, and I think some of them are going to be virtual. So I think this one in adversarialism and machine learning in the law could be really cool. Alexi says, Twitter technology goes to my notebook. Thank you. Love to have my misspeakings written down. I don't mind. That's a classic thing that linguists do to each other. Not an issue at all. Cultures for AI and AI for the cultures, tackling climate change with machine learning by doing less of it, perhaps, probably not. Vision transformers, not something I know anything about. I've mentioned a lot. I don't really work in computer vision by choice. Workshop on machine learning safety, I think, might be really cool and interesting. So lots of workshops that are going to be happening. And if you have work that you think would fit with one of these themes, then you can submit it to the workshop and maybe it'll get published. We'll see. So, good to keep an eye on. And NeurIPS, of course, is one of the probably the most well-known conference publication venue that focuses just on deep learning. Is it just deep learning? I've never actually been. I don't have a strong desire to go. I've heard some stories from my colleagues that make me think I might not have a great experience there. Let me put it that way. ICML is definitely more varied, but I think NeurIPS might be pretty narrowly focused on neural approaches. All right, and then just a couple examples of just a couple discussions of different conference talks on Twitter. Alexi says, I still remember the topological data analysis workshop at NeurIPS. It was awesome. Oh, cool. Yeah, that does sound cool. So this is an example that I think is pretty interesting. So this was tweeted by Lily Ray, who is someone who does SEO by day and DJs at night. Cool. Those are two different careers. And it is research by Will Reynolds, sorry, who does stuff on the internet and has a example of Google's Vision API where labels that should not have anything to do with race do in fact have things to do with race. So you can see here is a picture of a black woman wearing scrubs and a lab coat and a stethoscope, and which I would not call street fashion by any stretch of the imagination, but that is one of the labels that is returned for this. I can make it bigger. That is one of the labels that is returned for this particular image. And this is something that I would say is probably, has to do with her race, right? And that a lot of pictures of people wearing street fashion or that are labeled street fashion, regardless of what type of fashion it is, probably have disproportionately Black people in them. But when the nurse was painted white, the sort of similarly confident label was instead formal wear. And again, this is not formal wear, right? Scrubs and a lab coat and a stethoscope are not formal, nor are they street fashion. So the latent variable that those labels are picking up on does seem to be race, or at least skin tone, which may or may not have a relationship to race, depending on the place and time that you're in. But in the United States today, ooh, it sure does. So really interesting example of data leakage and racism in labeling. All right. And next up, so I think this is probably, so in linguistics, there is a difference then. Linguistics is different from NLP in that conference talks are usually discussions of research that's in progress, whereas in NLP, a conference talk is that the research is done and here you go. And this is by Nicole Holliday and Paul Reed, and it is at Sociolinguistics Symposium in Ghent, Belgium. And Nicole works on prosody, so like pitch, tone, but not lexical tone, right? So the way that your voice changes over the course of a sentence to indicate what's going on in that sentence, basically, more or less. I hope that's an okay description of prosody. Alexi says the fashion industry is really getting out of hand. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot going on with fashion, much of which is, harmful, and some of which is not, right? It's just like any industry, like a lot of technology is harmful and a lot of it's not, so, but this is a project on Amazon Halo, and this is a product that Amazon offers that has a built-in tone of voice analysis, right? So it'll tell you about your tone of voice. I've never used this. I would not, given the choice and the option, choose to use this. But one of the things that affects things like tone of voice are sociolinguistic factors that are associated particularly with, again, in the US, in general, Black people with the same affect are perceived as more angry, again, due to racism. So if you are, if you've encoded that perception in labeling for speech tokens, you're probably going to end up with that same perception being encoded in the final tool. And I imagine there will be a paper about this coming out soon, maybe, perhaps. I know Nicole has also been doing a series with Ben Zimmer on Wired about like Ask a Linguist stuff here on YouTube. So if you're interested, she's great researcher. I would check that out. Yep. Alexi says, gonna buy a lab coat to look good in the nightclub. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but you know what? Maybe it'll be a trend. Actually, ooh, one sec. I do have a lab coat somewhere. One sec. I'll be right back. Ta-da! I'm formal now. This is my, there we go. University of Washington lab coat that I had for science outreach events. So a little prop work, and I'm almost certainly gonna get too hot and take it off. It is the east coast of the US is in a big heat wave. I know Europe, y'all are in a big heat wave right now. It's pretty warm in here. So far I'm comfortable. We'll see how long I keep it on. But I have not since undergrad actually done lab work that required a lab coat. Not really something we do in linguistics in the lab. All right, next up. Oh, right, this is interesting. So I'm gonna say right off the bat, I don't work in robotics. I don't have a lot of, I would say deep understanding of robotics. I'm pretty sure Faye here is, I'm gonna check the paper really quickly. I know sometimes people can have the same name, so I'm just gonna double check that this is the Faye that I think it is. Maybe. Anyway, I may or may not have had an institutional affiliation with Faye at some point in the past. I don't think she worked in robotics though, but maybe she did. She was a very diverse scholar in terms of her interests. So disclosure of conflict of interest potentially. Anyway, don't know about robotics, but what really struck me, so this was being discussed on Twitter, what really struck me in the framing was maybe not the best grounding in terms of analogy with human behavior. So the sort of idea here is that large language models are used as part of this system, which, I mean, robotics happens in the world, so obviously it is physically grounded because you're interacting with the world, where basically during the process of the robot doing something, prompts are generated for the language model generates the output, and it's sort of like a feedback process that goes through the robotic, process, I guess. Anyway, one thing that really struck me about this is on the discussion online when the authors were talking about it, I think specifically it was one of these authors, and I don't know which one, and I should have kept the tweet, but I didn't. Was talking about internal monologues is like, we all know that people have internal monologues and they use that as a way to, relate to the world. And that's not really super grounded. So this is a Psychology Today article by, basically it's a summary of this person's research. Dr. Russell, now I'm getting too warm, Hurlburt, who works on researching inner monologues. And basically what he's found is that not everyone has an internal monologue, and of the people who do have an internal monologue, for most of us it's only present sometimes. And the sort of experimental way of validating this is, he'd be like, hey, you're having an internal monologue right now? And if they were, or they said they were, he was like, great, what's it saying? And asked for like a repetition of what the internal monologue was doing. I do sometimes. And interestingly, something I've noticed is that sometimes my internal monologue is just prosodic, particularly for like physical activities. So instead of it being like actual words, it'll just be like da 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 dun da 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 da. Any of you who've ever worked with a choreographer know exactly what I mean, and that's sort of what's going on in my head sometimes. Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad approach. I don't know enough about robotics to evaluate it, but I do think that, one thing that I have noticed in particularly deep learning research is this assumption that because sometimes humans do something, it's necessarily true of all humans, right? There's a lot of assumptions about human universals that are not true. The number of universal human behaviors are way lower than most people think they are. Cultural relativism is real, and culture is rich and complex, and I think tends to sometimes be underestimated by particularly people from a computer science background. Anyway, hey Robbie, it's not public. Ooh. I don't know what you're referring to, but let me know when the chat catches up. There's a little bit of a delay. Yeah, so I think this is, you know, again, I can't really evaluate the paper, but I would just say, you know, be mindful of making behavioral claims, particularly if you are not reading that behavioral literature, and also be very suspicious when you see those claims in a paper, right? And if like one of the authors is a psychologist and they're like, and here's the grounding in the psychological literature, or like here's the grounding in the anthropological literature, then I think that's a different story, but it seems to be a little bit rare. Same thing with language, right? People will come into language and be like, clearly it is so because I speak language and I know, which is not always actually the case. We have a lot of intuitions about language that are straight up false. Anyway, that's it for the research. The robotics isn't public. Interesting. I'll just refresh real quick. Okay, so it looks like this page is, but perhaps some of the other information is not. Robotics, hands. Interesting. Well, I'll post the link that I have up, and you can check it out if you like. All right, now on to the practical stuff. There's a lot of that this week. And starting off with kind of a bummer, and hopefully none of you know about this firsthand, but there's been some hiring freezes. So I think, you know, we've talked about it a little bit last week and the week before. The job market is slowing way down. We're entering a recession, maybe. I don't know, I'm not an economist. But if you are on the job market right now, it's a little bit tougher to find work. So this is from today, and I've verified the Google one. I haven't verified the GitHub one, but it seems like there are other sources that have. They have a hiring freeze, and the Google one is in theory for 2 weeks, and then they will unfreeze hiring. And hiring freeze just means no one's getting hired. So if you were interviewing, the interviews have stopped or paused, and they're not going to continue moving forward with that process to make an offer. And the public communication is that it's due to economic conditions. Meta, the company that owns Facebook, already has a free below E6, so that is I'm assuming that's engineer 6, that's a level. Oh, sorry, I kept seeing that sort of like Antarctica thing behind me, and I thought that it was actually behind me in the room, but it's not. And there is a chart here for just some of the bigger employers. I should say in the US, it does not seemed to be entirely US focused. We talked last week about, you know, people in India, and it sounds like Africa is also a little bit hard to find work right now. So yeah, just so you know, if you're struggling right now, it's probably not you. It's definitely not just you. So yeah, be aware that this is happening. Hey Hector, good to see you. And Lexi says, can confirm as a failed neuroscientist. Yeah, people are wonderful and complex and deserving of study. And yeah, I don't know, I like people. All right, on to, I don't know, I was gonna say maybe like less of a bummer news. I don't know that it actually is less of a bummer. So Mozilla released their internet health report this week, which I will link in the chat as well, because I think this is, you know, super interesting, valuable information. Of course, Mozilla is a nonprofit, knows a lot about the history of the internet as an organization, I would say. Has been around for a while with that sort of, you know, very nonprofit, public good ethos. I'm a fan of Mozilla, if that has not been obvious from my discussions in the past. Gotta hydrate. And part of the Internet Health Report was this really, I think, fabulous overview of who has power over AI, right? So systems using machine learning, which have this ability to scale, which have this ability to speed up previously slow tasks, who is using them on whom? I know we talk a lot about sort of, can I make that text bigger? Sure can. I know we talk a lot about imperialism on this channel and sort of like places that have more power, subjugating? I don't know. It's not always like direct, conquering, although, sometimes it is. Basically trying to make decisions for people who live in places with less power. And yeah, I think this is a really good crystallization of what that looks like in AI right now. Karen Howe had a really good, the AI Karen Howe, the Karen Howe who's a tech reporter who focuses on machine learning, not the Karen Howe who's a tech reporter who focuses on China. They're different people. Is a really good sort of like crystallization of what's going on here, right? So private investment into AI by country: the United States, 52 billion, China, 17 billion, the UK, 4.6 billion, and then sort of a tail end of Israel, Germany, Canada, France, India, Australia, and South Korea. You will notice missing on this list are, South America, Africa, a lot of places. And you can also see where data is being collected from, and the data that's being collected, how often it's being used. So again, you can see Africa and South America here look pretty anemic, right? And the United States looks, very bloated. A lot of data from the US gets used in a lot of ways that makes being in the US kind of the default in a lot of models, or looking like you're from the US, again, be the default. And then tops institutions by dataset usage. So whose data sets are being used the most often for performance benchmarking. So you collected a data set, so you have a model. Whose data are you going to use to benchmark it? Stanford leading the pack, and then Microsoft, and then Princeton, and then the Max Planck Society, which is based in the EU, and then Google, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, AT&T, etc. So again, very focused in the US, very focused at Stanford specifically. Alexei says, lucky to be in a country which is included on the list, TBH. Yeah, I mean, very practically, if you're a developer working in machine learning or working in NLP, probably you're going to be working in one of the countries where people have a lot of money to throw around at people doing that, right? I do. It's not a coincidence. Yeah, and then what's in the data set? So we have ImageNet, Lion 400. I am not familiar with this because it's an image data set. I am familiar with ImageNet. It's also an image data set, but it's been around longer, and there's been a lot of sort of early ethics work was done on ImageNet. Celeb A, 200,000 photos of celebrity faces. Common objects in context from Flickr, and then the Stanford Natural Language Inference data set. And, a lot of the labels, as they've talked about in here, are crowdsourced. So even though the data may be owned by people in the US, it does not necessarily follow that the work that went into creating that data set was done by people in the US. A lot of crowdsourcing is offshored. And we're going to talk about that and some of the ramifications of that a little bit later on. So, yeah, a great point from Resetya Safala, apologies if I'm saying that incorrectly, who's a computer vision researcher at DARE. One of the major things that we should be thinking about are the people behind the data points and the people creating these algorithms, which are often not the same, right? Yeah. Robbie says, mostly are tribal areas, and yeah, MPI. Oh yeah, the Max Planck Institute. Yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking about Robbie's comment. In the US context, I probably wouldn't use tribal in that way, but definitely places where, you know, historically, a lot of value has been removed from by white colonizers. Let me put it just very bluntly, and it continues to be. Yeah, I mean, India, another place where that's very, very relevant. Yeah, which, not news to y'all, I know. Lots of places where it's relevant, unfortunately. Yeah, and then just a really, really good discussion about who's getting the money, and it's tech companies, right? Mostly Amazon, Apple, Microsoft. Sorry, this one's Google, this one's Microsoft, Facebook, Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu are all Chinese companies, and they're always up at the top. But you know, mostly the money is flowing into the West and into the US, which. Is that fair? No. No, but that's where it is. And sort of a breakdown of how Amazon uses AI to make money, mostly for online shopping. And then how much do companies actually say how they're using the data and what they do with it? So I think there's been a lot of sort of user frustration over the algorithm and automated recommendation systems and the ways that those change user experience, and particularly as content creators. I mean, as a content creator, right? What the largest source of views on YouTube is YouTube's recommendations, and I have no control over that, and I do not have transparency into that. And as a result, something that has like a huge effect on me as an individual and on my work, I don't have any control over or understanding of. And I would say I probably have more understanding than most people because I you know, have an AI background, but even then, like, what are the features? What are the weights? And they're changing constantly, so I have no idea, you know, what's most important for me right now. And as a user, that's very, as a creator of content, that's very, you know, disconcerting. It's, you just guess, you just do your best, and you try to do good content, and YouTube says they reward that, and that's what they say. And another, speaking of YouTube and recommendations, most people who discovered videos they regret watching on YouTube discover them through recommendations, which again is the primary driver of YouTube views. Oh, thank you. Some good additional information from the chat. So 9Gaming says, Lion 400 has text-image pairs. It's one of the largest open data sets for text-image training. Okay, noted. A task that I have not a huge fan of. Let me put it that way. Yeah, Alexi has an interesting topic. You know how we sometimes have to look at the data set with our own eyes? Yes, it's always good to do. I remember one post which asked, what was the weirdest thing you found in your data? And it had some very interesting and some very disturbing submissions. What was a weird thing you found in your data? Oh, my data. I'm asking myself two questions right now, which one is your question, and the other is what can I talk about publicly? Because of course I'm under, you know, NDAs for the companies that I worked at previously. I mean, probably the most frustrating thing that I found in my data is that I was working, so I was at Raza, which is we make chatbots, and I was working on developing a chatbot publicly as like a, here's how you do it, code along sort of series. And when I had the chatbot ready to test and share with users so that I could, you know, annotate their data and be like, and here's how our data annotator work. Somebody used the system to just write slurs. So I had a data set that was predominantly, you know, racial slurs, really horrible words, things that I would never condone the usage of. And yeah, and like I said, I in general, I like people in general. I like to trust people, but that was an institution where my an example where my trust was betrayed. And yeah, I don't suppose weird, but like, I think about that. And, you know, just data poisoning in general. So, yeah. Yashasvi, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, says, would you recommend news article summarization when we can't afford data loss or factual loss? How can we approach this problem? I mean, if you absolutely can't lose data, then you should probably just read the full article. I realize that's not very... any summarization technique has the risk of losing information, so I would just be aware of that and decide whether or not this is the right approach for your project. But the sort of thing that I would do is there's two types of summarization. There's abstractive and extractive. And probably you're going to want to do extractive, where you find the relevant factual bits and just extract them and use that as your summarization, rather than trying to rewrite it in a more condensed form, would be my general approach. Or you could do, you know, yeah, that's probably what I'd do. Ooh. Sorry, screen saver turned on. I waited too long. That's probably what I would do, but you do know that you will have at some point some loss of information. Yep. Anyway, very good report. I think very worth reading, very interesting. This personalized prices gives me hives, right? So the idea of, like, if you're using a product, we know a lot about you and we're going to decide how much to charge you based on what we know about you is a thing that happens. So anyway, I don't want to go through the whole thing in full, but definitely check it out. I think it's very eye-opening, and I think it's really nice to have a concrete example of a lot of the things I talk about with power shifting and extractive relationships, etc. Yeah, okay, moving on. So I mentioned that we were going to talk about the ramifications of Cognition says, oh, wow, I hate that. Yep. Yeah, it's not good. I would be shocked if Amazon hadn't implemented it where it was legal to do so. I'm not going to say I'm not going to be saying, yes, I said what I meant. Yeah, you're very welcome. Good luck with your project, Shishabi. All right, so I mentioned that there were ramifications to offshoring dataset labeling, and particularly in situations where it is culturally dependent and requires a lot of information about the situation where the language usage was used. The language was used, where your language usage examples are from. And this is a great example where we had some labelers who are not super familiar with the underlying sort of like cultural understanding that the language users shared with each other. And as a result, a lot of this data set was mislabeled. So this is, and I should say, first of all, this Surge AI company is a data labeling company. So I'm sure that this is going to be like a little bit of a pitch for their labeling, which is clearly better than, you know, than the crowdsourcing labeling that this team used. But they went through and they did a hand analysis of, you know, 100 random comments. So pretty big sample actually for a 58K data set, and had people relabel them basically. So we'd call this inter-rater reliability, seeing if two raters have the same rating for the same item, and it looks like they did not. And there were a lot of examples of mislabeled emotions. So this one, like, let's effing go, was mislabeled as anger. I would say that this is like excitement, positive affect, likely because Google's low quality labelers didn't understand English slang and mislabeled any profanity as a negative emotion. And I think I don't really like the phrasing low quality labelers, right? Like, people do not have qualities attached to them besides the quality of being like deserving of respect and autonomy, and all their human rights. But I think that this is a poor match of labelers to tasks. So I would say something like poorly matched labelers. And that makes sense, right? If you are, I'm sure many of you are second language speakers of English. If you have not been a lot online, you may not have come across this particular thing. And also if somebody, you know, in like a bar fight was like, hey, let's effing go, that would be angry, right? So the context really matters. And I think these labelers were not familiar with the context in which this language is being used, hence the mislabeling. And it does not mean that this person was actually angry. And I would guess, based on the sort of fact that this is from Reddit, that they probably weren't. Yeah. Alexi says, that kind of thing happens, but the weirdest things are the ones you find something you have no idea about, some images or pieces of text. Alexi says, I feel anger. Yep. If there was a link, oh yeah, let me pop that link in this one. So this is the Mozilla Internet Health Report, which I believe they do every year. And this one had a big section on AI, and just really excellent work from the Mozilla team. Good job. Yeah. Nine Gaming says, how can we remedy the mislabeling when there are annotators labeling 80% of the data? Do we really train on the tasks or the annotators? Good question. It's the annotators, right? We train on the labels, and we train on the relationship between the labels and the input. And if that relationship does not reflect the intended relationship by the language producers, then yeah, the models are useless. Ye old garbage in, garbage out. When I mentioned my mom was a programmer before I was born, but when I was a kid, she had a mug that said garbage in, garbage out, but in Latin. And I remember asking her to explain it to me, and she did. And it holds true, right? Like, poor quality data in, poor quality model out. Yeah, you're very welcome. So, or this one, you almost blew my effing mind there. Like, this person is like having a really good time. They've learned something surprising and enjoyable, you know, but I would say that that is not annoyance, right? Or someone saying like, damn girl. I would say that this is something like appreciation or respect perhaps, or something like that, right? Definitely not anger. And yeah, a good example here where blank wept as sort of a play on Jesus wept. So like this language play, this very contextual and formal usage, I think is very easy to mislabel. Yeah, and if you were interested in using this Go Emotions data set, maybe relabel it. Maybe don't. I think you might end up with a not super helpful model. So good to look at your data set. Oh, what's written on my mug right now is not that. It is BLS, which stands for the Berkeley Linguistic Society. And if I get real close, you might be able to see. So this one has like a waveform and some like wave decompositions. And this one has some syntax trees. And this one has some like neurons and like a little typographic or graph. It's got a graph on it to show relationships between things. Yeah, so I got this at the Berkeley Linguistic Society meeting where I was presenting my research in maybe 2014? Maybe? Yeah. Andre says, the article Snake Island during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine in Wikipedia contains so much negative emotion. Yeah, I'll bet. I'll bet. Yeah. I don't know. Definitely on my mind right now. Anyway, great case study, why it's extremely important to look at your data and look at data quality. Next up, I know I rag on computer vision a lot, and I am very critical of it as a field, and I think there's lots of harmful things to do with it, but this one I think is okay, right? And this is a computer vision little app that someone's made to identify diseases in rice paddies. So this is designed to be like an aid to farmers who are like, I don't know which disease this is, and they take a picture and they upload it and they're like, clearly it's this disease. Although it looks like it's not, it's pretty conclusive that this seems to be blast, which type of plant disease. So why do I think that this in particular is a good use for the technology? A, hopefully it's accurate and helpful to farmers. It can help, you know, the ecological impact could be very beneficial because if there is a specific disease that has a specific treatment, then that specific treatment can be used instead of, you know, a full spectrum treatment that maybe include unnecessary weed killer application or something like that, which, you know, bad for the environment, bad for the farmers. That stuff is expensive. Plus then the labor to apply it to the field. Yeah, potential to be very helpful, assuming you are working with farmers that can't identify necessarily plant diseases by sight. So maybe, you know, you have been planting something else and now you're planting a new crop and you've got a problem with the crop and you don't know what it is. I think, you know, if it's a crop you've been planting for 10, 20 years, you know what the common, issues are by sight. So yeah, and you know, it's not humans, it's working on plants. Plants don't need to consent. There's no such thing as human rights for plants. So overall, pretty good project. Good job. And I think this was from EuroPython this year. Yeah. What type of data makes it difficult to interpret a machine learning model, according to me? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think model interpretability is independent from the data inputs, right? Because that is a quality of the model and not a quality of the data. So like a linear model is very easy to interpret, and that can be done on a wide variety of types of data. I would say that in general, engineered secondary features can be less interpretable than hand-designed features, because hand-designed features relate to something that a human has noticed in the data set. So in general, it can be a little bit easier to interpret, but you may or may not get the same boost to model performance with it. So just sort of in general, I think any data set can be used to train a very interpretable model, and every data set can be used to train a very opaque model. So Sharon says, pretty useful, yeah. Or I could see this being useful for like gardeners, yeah. And some discussion in Cyrillic. All right, and this is a a great example by Ada, and she has she is playing around with a gender detector. We've talked before, you cannot automatically detect gender, you have to ask people, and there's really no reason to do it to begin with. And as you can see, you know, she takes her hair down and makes a little pouty face. It's definitely female. You know, a very dour face, like puts the hair back up. Oh, that's definitely a man. So great example of why when I talk about these systems not being good or useful, this is why, right? Like the same person whose gender is, you know, I don't know if she's gender fluid, but if she is, she's not changing her gender expression, you know, significantly in the course of the video, and the model is, you know, drastically changing its output. So just know why, don't do it. It's kind of a fun toy, but I think that's about all it is. All right. And this I thought was sort of interesting. So we talked about actually with the code review, we talked about, it was what, 2 weeks ago, last week? We talked about don't repeat yourself as sort of like a programming principle. And I think what happened was Cognition was like, wow, yeah, yes. Certainly surprising. Yeah. Alexi says there are people who are not sure what gender they are, even if you ask them. I mean, there are, you know, I think a lot of people have a very restrictive view of gender and what it can be that is not reflected in the experiences of people in the world, right? So when we say gender is a social construct, right, what we mean is that it's different genders are associated with different performances, right? Different aspects of performance, right? So in, you know, in my culture, in my time, having long hair, wearing earrings, wearing makeup are all associated more with a particular gender than any of the others, but not exclusively, right? And there's a lot of variation and a lot of genders and a lot of ways that people can relate to their gender. It's a very complex topic, right? And I think one thing that can be helpful is to relate it to other things that are equally socially constructed, right? So I'm trying to come up with a very value neutral example, which can be a little bit difficult. So like being a sports fan, right? So I can support a specific team, and I can do lots of behaviors that let you know that I'm a supporter of that team, right? I can attend their games, I can wear their merchandise, I can, you know, be involved in like ritualistic call and response. If they have chants, I might know all the chants. Right, so I have a lot of behaviors that I do that represent, you know, the fact that I am a fan of that sports team. But the idea of like a sports team existing is not, you know, an inherent, it is true in the world, but it was not, you know, inevitable or in any way predetermined that there would be sports teams. So this is, gender's complex. And again, if you absolutely need gender, ask people, but I think that most people don't. And particularly, again, like we were talking about human universals, the idea that, let's say, there being exactly two genders as a human universal is ludicrous and easily disprovable, right? Or even the idea that there are two sexes is a biological universal is, again, laughably disprovable, even within like vertebrates, right? We're gonna really narrow it down and say things that are, or even within mammals, right? Things that are like quite related to us. It is not necessarily the case. So yeah, I don't want to get into a whole big discussion necessarily, but nuance is important. And I've mentioned before on this channel, I really believe in self-determination, and I really believe in the importance of people being in charge of their selves and their experiences, and you know, respecting people. Hopefully you all feel respected. That's certainly my intention. And being, you know, accurate with people's gender labels and asking them what they are and respecting them, I think, is important. So yeah, a little bit of a discussion there. And I would say I'm not a gender researcher, but I am friends with some. It's about where I fall on that spectrum of knowing about gender. So yeah, so don't repeat yourself. And I think what I mentioned in the code review is like, oh, it looks like there's a little bit of repeated code here, but it's only really repeated twice, so I don't think it would necessarily make sense to pull this out for a function. But there were a lot of functions that I was using repeatedly, so those were sort of like captured out and tucked away in a way that was a little bit more organized. But just a couple points here that I think are good points. So one is, if you are repeating something, but it's not necessarily, you know, if you are repeating something and it is not because of the underlying, wow, if it's a coincidence that there's repetition, I'm trying to rephrase this and doing an awful job. If it's just a coincidence that there's repetition, you don't want to treat that as something that is true underlying. So in this example here, you know, there's two pieces that have like some shared features and then some different features. The point the author's making here is that those shared features are just a coincidence, right? So you can imagine a situation where you're making a pizza, but you need like a stuffed crust or a regular crust, or you may have a white sauce, or you may have an olive oil sauce, right? So these are actual manipulable variables. And if you're trying to chunk them together and treat them as the same thing, then that's going to be an issue. You know. Yeah, Andre, so that is, okay, we're going back to the gender thing. Just because I think it's important, and I think that, again, a lot of people just haven't had a lot of education in this general arena. So Andre says that it's very simple, that XX are female chromosomes and XY are male chromosomes. So first of all, I would say that most of us probably have a pretty strong idea of what our gender is. If I asked you what your gender is, you could probably give me a very, you know, quick answer. You wouldn't have to think about it a whole bunch. You may, you know, depending on what your gender is, you may need to like suss out whether or not you thought I was going to do violence to you, but that's a separate thing, right? You would know what the answer is. My second question to you is, have you ever had your genome sequenced? the vast majority of people haven't. I haven't. Like, I know that my gender is female because of, you know, my internal sense of self, but I don't know what my chromosomes are, right? I've never had them sequenced. As Alexi points out, there's a lot of variation in chromosomal makeup. And even when, you know, you have a certain set of chromosomes, there's a lot of variation in hormones. And even within the amount of variation in hormones, there's a lot of variation in the amount of effect that different hormones have on you as an individual, right? I know that particularly coming from computer science backgrounds, a lot of people tend to like to think that there's lots of like firm boundaries in the world, right? Like we all know what a species is, right? Well, biology is very squishy, and it's a lot more variable and a lot less clean cut than it is when it's taught to children. Just to be, I'm not calling you childlike. I am not saying that you are a child. I'm saying that the way that very, very simple concepts are introduced to children are often incorrect, right? So, you know, if you're introducing computers to children, you might be like, this is a machine that thinks. We know that's not how computers work, right? Or you might say, this is a really fancy calculator. I mean, kind of, like maybe a little bit, but these really simplified explanations, a lot of people never learn anything more, or never have to learn anything more, and just sort of carry them around with them, right? And like, I know there's things that like were the case for me with that. I'm trying to come up with a really good example for this. Oh, here's a great one. So when I was a kid, I learned about the names of different flowers, and some of it I learned from my family, and some of it I learned it from like other people in my life, and some of it I learned from like TV shows and stuff. And for a really long time, I, didn't use the scientific names. And when I was in grad school, and like I like gardening, I like plants, I learned for the very first time that cornflowers and chicory are the same plant, right? But I had always separated those in my head because people have always been like, oh, that's cornflower, oh, that's chicory. And cornflower to me was, the petals that you would use, and chicory was the root that you'd use in like coffee and stuff. And I didn't know that they were the same plant because I was just ignorant of it. So the more I learned, the more, complex and nuanced my understanding of the world became. And, that's a process that we're all going through all the time. TX says, let's defer to the biologist on this one. You see lots of Twitter threads about how, the simple paired chromosome rule is not so simple, and to give a more nuanced account and just trust the scientists on this. Yeah, and like, for the vast majority of us, the, biological sex and hormone regulation and, genomic sequencing is not something we need to really interact with that much in day-to-day life, and a simple understanding of it can be fine. But I think it's important to know, for all of us to know the shape of our own ignorance. So like when we were talking about the robotics paper, I was like, I don't know about robotics. I don't know if this is a good paper or not, because I just don't have the background to, to pick that apart and to place it in context. And yeah. Alexi says, more unnuanced is a heavy understatement. Yeah, biology is wild. It's absolutely wild. Something else I learned pretty recently is that there is a muscle in the forearm that only about a quarter of people have. So like a lot of, even like things like anatomy, right, will be like, oh, well, these are the muscles. Not everyone has all those muscles, and some people have extra, and they just don't tell you about that. Like even when this is completely unrelated, but I'm studying for my personal trainer certification just because it's something I've always wanted to do. And in the anatomy lessons that we took there, we didn't talk at all about individual variation, but I knew from my other anatomical studies, there is a huge degree of individual variation in terms of anatomy. And like, some people's hearts are on the right, and you probably wouldn't know about it. Anyway, yeah. Biology is squishy and interesting and very, very complex. T-Rex says, I thought bunnies and rabbits were different until high school. Yes, until grad school. Yeah, right? Because you'd seen those words in different contexts, and you had like that, that relationship. Yep. Anyway, Alexei says, I've been lucky enough to be a straight XY male and grown as one, and even I have a hard time understanding and comprehending my masculinity. I can't imagine how it is for everyone else. Yeah, it's a, you know, you can almost think about it as religion, right? Like if you have a religious affiliation, you know what it is, and it feels correct to you. And gender's the same, right? Like you know what your religion is, you know what your gender is. Again, if you have either. Yeah, anyway, long rant. And this page is about like, maybe we don't always need to make everything completely dry and non-repeated. Moving on. Alexei says, recently we even discovered a new organ in the human body, interstitium. Oh yeah, is that like the webbing between internal organs that we thought was fascia? I vaguely remember reading about this. It was a while ago. Yeah. Robbie says, under the hood, we're all made up of subparticles. Very true. Very true if you go down far enough. Speaking of Berkeley and metaphors, small being down. Sorry, that was a reference because some of the Berkeley faculty are very into metaphors. Like, is it the Lakoffs that wrote Metaphors to Live By? Hold, please. Yeah. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson wrote Metaphors to Live By, which is a comparative cultural linguistics book about the ways that metaphorical thought is reflected in language use and differences across culture, which it's a cool book. I'd recommend it. It's a good popular science book. Anyway, so this is it's from the Rand Corporation, which is a nonprofit, and I don't think has anything to do with Ayn Rand. I was also not sure about that if you are yourself unsure. And they say they're nonpartisan, but I think this might be a useful, pop this open. I think that this might be a useful resource if you have people in your life who are just learning about deepfakes and potential issues. And this in particular is designed to be an introduction to deepfakes and disinformation. So just a difference between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is intentionally deceptive, and misinformation is mistakenly deceptive. That's how I remember it. So disinformation, they mean to be lying to you. Misinformation, they believe what they say, but they're wrong, basically. And this is designed to be an introduction to policymakers in particular about, what deepfakes are, what the worries are, what's going on with them. We'll talk about them a little bit more. They talk about sort of like the cost of graphics cards, voice cloning. So I think it's, for many of you, I think this is just going to be review, but if you wanted to share a resource with, say, maybe an executive or somebody, and you're like, hey, this is a security risk, might be a helpful resource. Alexei says, please don't use any religion to understand your sexuality. I mean, for some religions, sexuality and sexual expression is a part of it. And I'm, again, self-determination, that is for y'all and as individuals to interact with. And this is a really cool thread that Data Science Renee started. I'm pretty sure she's actually in Charlottesville, which is like, I don't know, hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on traffic and how much you want to speed. From Richmond, which is where I live. It's in Virginia, basically. That's all you need to know. And she asked, for those of you who earned an official data science degree, was there any course assigned readings or similar in your program about the dangers of misapplied predictive modeling, historical biases, unintended impacts, authoritarian misuse of data, facial recognition, etc.? And I thought it was just a really cool discussion and lots of examples of people talking about it and different things. We have people who are teaching courses, people who are like, yeah, I learned a little bit about that. There's a compulsory lecture, which I would say a single lecture is probably insufficient. We talk about ethics every stream. It's something I think a lot about. But yeah, sounds like the topics are pretty good. Renee's great. I really like her. She has a lot of professional resources, particularly for people who are just getting started in data science. So really good person to follow. Yeah, so lots of interesting things and discussions and people's different educational experiences with ethics curriculum, which I think is interesting. So I'll pop a link to this in the chat as well if you want to read through the thread. Alexi said it would be cool to have it in different languages. I have a hard time just explaining what my job is to my parents. Yeah, it's different, huh? Yeah, I don't know if it's been translated or not. All right, and then speaking of misinformation, so mistakes, this is a really good thread that includes a lot of examples where when you search for Google, you get that like card at the top, which has additional information that's been pulled out, like quick results. I forget what they're called. Anyway, and a lot of these examples are wrong, right? That, you know, I as a linguist would be like, no. And the sort of the point of this thread is that there's lots of issues where there is a, you know, something that's like mostly accurate or partly accurate, or maybe like written for a lay audience or written by somebody without linguistics training. And then it's extracted, and in the extraction and rephrasing, it gets, you know, basically, hi, yes, you're very cute. My dog came in to sit down and stare at me. And in the extraction and having that being presented as the definitive answer to the question, it results in people getting the wrong information about language, right? So just an example here. So I'm just gonna read what he wrote. Sorry, that was my dog. Sometimes he goes pew. So the extract is the answer to what are the 5 varieties of languages. These include pidgins, creoles, regional dialects, minority dialects, and indigenized varieties. Many people think these varieties are just incorrect ways of speaking, but they're not. They're just different. And I would say that these are not even, like, if these were all sets, they wouldn't cover the set of all possible languages, right? Like the union of these is still going to not be, you know, equivalent to the union of all languages. Yep. Solomon says discussion is very interesting. Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoy it. Yeah, I do talk a lot about AI and NLP. Congregation says, wowie. Yeah. And then this one, ugh. So this is something that people ask linguists all the time. What's the hardest language to learn? And the answer is just Mandarin Chinese, 6th hardest language for English speakers to learn. I'm just going to go out and say the single most widely spoken language in the world, you have a lot of language resources available. Yes, you know, English is not tonal, but grammatically Mandarin and English are actually kind of close. There's not a whole bunch of case in Mandarin, for example, which a lot of other languages do. It is a survey, a survey by a language learning app. Probably the hardest language for an English speaker to learn is going to be a language where none of the speakers of that language also speak English, right? That's going to be very typologically distinct from English. So yeah, anyway, just a bunch of examples where the sort of the snippet that the search result is returning is not an accurate answer, right? I would say the hardest language to learn is going to be dependent on you and your situation, and you have probably never even heard of or thought of the one that would be the single most difficult language for you as a speaker to learn. Anyway, good discussion about that there, and that is by Philip Kramer, P.H. Kramer, who is a linguist, creolist, Romanist, Neerlandicist. I think that means that he is Dutch from Saarland and Berlin. Or maybe he lives in Germany? I don't know. Anyway, he's European. Yeah. Good. Alexi says, I start to seriously think about these things after I found your stream. Fantastic. That makes me really happy. That's why I do it. Robbie says, an AI news reporter. Nice. So, moving on. Sorry. You can hear my dog mooing. Alexi says it's hard to learn singleton languages, the ones where you have no really similar ones. For example, Korean is a real challenge for Alexi. Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about Korean is that the writing system is very transparent. to the pronunciation, which is not the case, for example, for English or any pictographic languages. But yeah. Cognition says, I thought there was a dog emote, but it only shows up with a browser extension. No. Vvolt says, puppy. Yeah. He's a sweetheart. Yeah. JuliaCon is live right now. If you wanted to go see a live talk, you could. I don't think this is gonna pick up any sound if I do. Yeah, so it is even now going on. Oh, looks like some brain imaging. Julia, if you're not familiar, is a language for statistical computing that was sort of developed by computer language nerds. Nerds is used affectionately there, people who care way more about computer languages than I do, to be more performant than, you know, R or doing statistical computing with Python. If you're doing statistical computing with Python, please stop doing that. Your life will be so much better if you switch to a specialized language. So yeah, if you're interested in learning Julia, a bunch of data science talks. It's going to be very statistics heavy, very computing language heavy, presumably about using Julia, and feel free to give it a shot. The last time I seriously tried to learn Julia, they only had ASCII support, but I believe that has been improved. So you can now use, you know, UTF characters in Julia as well, if it's been a while. Andre says, do you recognize dog languages? Animals do not have languages. Language is a uniquely human trait, and I am willing to die on that hill. But there is a lot of dog communication, and I'm actually have a book that I would recommend if you're interested in learning more about dog communication. And the book is called Doggy Language, and has some really cute illustrations. And from my understanding of talking to people who work in animal behavior, it is pretty accurate. Yeah, so if you're interested in dog communication and body language, I would recommend this book, but they do not in fact have language. But yes, I've studied, I haven't studied like officially, but animal communication is something that I think is really interesting, and I do read in occasionally. And this is a nice, like, it'll be good for kids, it would be good for like a general audience. So JuliaCon was the last thing. Alexi says, next time you undermine Python, I'm unsubscribing. Tools are good for different things. Like if you're building, you know, if you're doing a lot of front-end stuff in R, maybe try Flask, right? Maybe Python is the better tool for that. So yeah, Cognition says, JuliaCon 2022 is happening right now. Lots of talks on YouTube popping up. Yes, it is. So if you are interested in Julia, good resource. Go check it out. Robbie asks if I'm going to use Julia. Yeah, we might play around with it in another stream, but like the issue is I don't think that there's a lot of NLP libraries for Julia, and I am not a huge fan of starting from scratch, basically. But yeah, maybe we'll see. It's been a while since I looked into the human language capabilities of Julia, so it might be something to check out. Alexi says, the writing system is perfect, but the logic and vocabulary, and then something in Hangul that I'm going to assume is a little bit rude. Solomon says, between R and Julia, what language do I prefer for statistical computing? Definitely R, because I'm used to it, and that's a big part of it. I'm a big fan of the tidyverse, which is like a collection of packages for doing data analysis. So, but maybe if I'd learned Julia first, I'd prefer Julia. Who knows? Python is a general purpose programming language. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I use Python. I'm not dunking on Python. I'm just saying that, like, if you're trying to do a lot of statistical modeling in Python, it will be faster for you to use other tools. Oh, all right. There's a channel where someone taught the dog to use buttons to communicate. Yeah, Bunny. I'm familiar. I would say that I genuinely believe that the owners of the dogs that are using buttons, they're not trying to defraud anyone. I believe that they genuinely do believe that their dog is talking to them. I also genuinely believe that it's the clever Hans effect, which is basically where the trainer or the handler is unintentionally giving cues to the dog in order, and Hans was a horse, but like unintentionally giving cues, right? He didn't mean to. He wasn't like trying to defraud people. He genuinely believed his horse could count. But animals are very good at, body language, and very good at understanding cues from their handlers, and unintentionally got cues, right? And if you play with and get excited every time your dog comes over and presses a button, and it learns that if it presses a bunch of different buttons, you're even more excited and it gets more attention, then probably your dog is going to do that, right? So yes, I tend to be pretty skeptical about claims of syntax in animals, including with dolphins, Ravi. Yep. Cognition says they've accidentally trained the dog to appear to be communicating with language, almost surely. Yep, 100%. 100%. That's fair. T-Rex says, I would say scientific or numerical over statistical computing. That's fair. Robbie says Python is the worst language. I don't think that's true. I mentioned before, I've tried to learn Perl. I would prefer to use Python very strongly. Self-determination, right? Pick your own language that you prefer to use. Anyway, Center for Democracy and Technology has a new task force convening tech companies, scholars, and advocates to protect reproductive health information. I bring this up in case any of you work at a company that's interested in protecting reproductive health information and want to work together to find solutions. So reach out to them. I think there's a form down here or whatever. Anyway, I would reach out to the Center for Democracy and Technology if you're working with a company that think would benefit from working with them. Oh, this one. Alexi says, what is language? That's a really good question. It's a very loaded question, so I'm going to give you the short answer, and maybe at some point in the future we can have a long answer, but it is a system of human shared communication, social communication, that includes the ability to I'm really trying to decide how much to get into this, but basically some of the qualities that linguists will look for are compositionality, right? So you can take bits, you can rearrange them, the rearranging changes the meaning, you can add things together, you can subtract things apart, being able to refer to things that are not present, being able to refer to things that are abstract or qualities of things rather than the thing as a whole. Displacement is sometimes what the being able to refer to things that are not present is. And there's been so much ink spilled on this. But I would say basically it's a human languages or a human communication system that are acquired, not learned by children, is how I would, in the most basic way, put that. Alexi says human. Yeah, I'm just gonna put it in the definition. Fight me. Yeah, I hear you, bud. Sorry about... He's very lasery today. Bobby says language is subjective in nature. In that language exists as a result of human experiences, yes. Cognition says, big question. Yeah. We're dealing with the, light questions today. What is gender? What is language? Sritron says, pick your own based on use case for computer languages. Yeah, absolutely. Or, what other people are using in your company. I would not recommend starting to work with a brand new language if you are in a company where everyone else is using a different language. Naj Mikhail says, why Julia over R or MATLAB? So Julia was designed to be very performant. So if R is, you've done a lot of optimization and you're still needing very fast performance, maybe Julia is for you. Like I said, I'm not entirely sure currently what it's like for NLP. There's a lot of NLP tools in R. There's a lot of NLP tools in Python. I think there's fewer in Julia, but maybe some. And over MATLAB, MATLAB can also be very performant. MATLAB is a little weird as a language, as the way that it handles data structures. MATLAB is also very much not free. MATLAB is expensive. Julia and R are both free, so that is a confounding factor. Alexi says, the very next moment your dog tries to communicate with you. Yeah, I'm not... There's a difference between language and communication, right? And there's a difference between language and communication systems. Language is more complex. Language has the ability for more complexity. Language has, you know, displacement, like all those things I was talking about. There are more qualities of language than just a communication system. Right, like I would say bees absolutely have a communication system, and I think a lot of time people use language to refer to that. And like I don't go around correcting people, but from a scholarly standpoint, it is not capital L language. Yep. Alexi says, readability counts. Special cases aren't special enough to break the rules, although practicality beats purity. Error should never pass silently unless explicitly silent. I'm assuming that that refers to Julia, perhaps? Julia overcame Python in terms of favorite programming language, C Stack Overflow. Oh, interesting. Sorry. Cough drop for the voice. And this was something that happened this week that I think is going to become, unfortunately, increasingly important for folks. And that is that I mentioned there's a big European heat wave. Those of you in Europe, stay cool, do your best. And it got so hot that the data centers were just taken down, right? The computers couldn't continue to function. And I think I've mentioned before my sort of like personal litmus test as a person living in the South of the United States, which is a tropical place, basically, is that, you know, 10 is chilly, 20 is cool, 30 is warm, 40 is hot, and it got hot. Like by the standards of the South, it got hot in the UK, which is not a place built to withstand southern summers. So I know like air conditioning is very rare, and a lot of the houses are very insulated and don't have like great airflow because usually you want to keep them warm. So I imagine this is something that we're going to have to think about in the future as well as engineers. I think the summer could be a time when we see a lot of outages just in general. So good to know about, if very much a bummer. Speaking of bummers. Oh, hey, DJ. Good to see you. Okay, so just talking about different, like, programming concepts, I think. Salem is language is an agreement of some group of people to understand each other. And Ravi says, I agree with you. Yeah, I think that's you know, as a working definition, I think that's perfectly fine. All right, this story was wild. So I've talked quite a bit about deepfakes as a security concern and why I don't like them and how I think they can do a lot of harm. But something that happened recently is that some mayors in Europe, so like the mayor of Berlin in this case, thought that he was having an online meeting with the current mayor of Kyiv, and he was not. He was talking to a deepfake. So in a matter of like international politics, a person in a position of great authority was fooled, not entirely, right? Like partway through the conversation, he was like, oh, wait a second, this is not who they say they are, but certainly fooled enough to create the meeting in the first place. So yeah, I think we're gonna see more of this. I know I do try to find positive examples of computer vision stuff, but I really kind of feel like maybe we shouldn't be working with humans that much, but oh well, I'm not in the field. By choice. All right, on the next one. So some of you may remember that a while ago, 10 years, no. 2012, 10 years, no. Sorry, I just had like the feeling of time passing and just realizing how long it's been. 10 years ago, I was gonna say maybe like 5. This article was published about like data science is going to be the sexiest job of the 21st century. I certainly saw it at the time. I'm sure many of you did as well. And this is sort of a reprise of that article 10 years later. My God. I've done so much math since then. Anyway, by Thomas Davenport and DJ Patil, who some of you may know from other stuff. He's also done quite a bit of work on ethics. And this article that I'll just link so you all can read it if you would like, talks about sort of what's changed since then. And basically, the field has become a lot more mature. We are expected to be a little bit more specialized, so no one, some people still do, but it's a lot less common for people to expect a data scientist to come in and do everything. And it's like, oh, you need to hire a team, you know, you need to hire like a database expert and a modeling expert and a deployment expert. And there's more narrowing within the field or within the roles, and also a expectation that you're going to know about more things, right? Like ethics, which I believe they talk about, quite a bit here. So something we should think about. And, you know, just again, very practically, if your company is doing something wildly unethical, it's not going to be that long before legislation hopefully catches up with it, and you're going to be in not a great position. So yeah, really good article. I think it's a great sort of view into how the field has changed over this time. And yeah, I'd say we're getting there towards being a more mature field. Like, we're not where software engineering is, or even like physical training, personal training, to be completely honest, in terms of maturity, but definitely getting better. So Robbie says computer vision has no ambiguity problem like in language. They're much rarer. They do exist. So if y'all remember the dress, right? So it was a photo of a dress that some people said looked yellow and white, and some people said looked blue and black. It was a blue and black dress photographed in a weird light. There are instances where there is ambiguity in a computer vision thing, but yes, it is much rarer than it is in language. Language tends to be much more ambiguous, which is why puns exist. Another good resource, we are not even halfway through, my God, that I came across this week. I have not read this, I should say, but I did sort of like flip through it and it looked pretty useful. So this is out of the University of Arizona, and it is a book, Deep Learning for Natural Language Processing, a gentle introduction. Yeah, I think could be potentially very helpful. The Stanford book, Speech and Language Processing, has some sections on deep learning, but it's also a little bit more general. So if you're interested in getting further into deep learning, might be a good resource. I mean, it is free. So yeah, maybe something to check out. And let me know if any of y'all have read it, if you liked it or not. Cognition says, oh no, not the dress. Yep. Lexi says, my heart fully goes out to Ukraine, but I don't understand how they would not differentiate the current narrator of Kyiv from an AI, because he speaks worse than the current AI models. I can't speak to that. Okay. I'm gonna have a drink of water. Are any of you familiar with TideLift? Do any of you use TideLift? Because this is the first time I think I've heard about it, and I'm interested but suspicious. That's where I'm standing right now on this. Sorry, I gotta keep my voice going. Like 2 to 3 hours of continuously talking is a lot of talking. So TideLift is this company that companies can subscribe to, and I think it's $30,000 a year to subscribe. And what they do is they then pay maintainers of open source packages, and I think there is some expectation that the maintainers are then going to be sort of kind of on call for the companies who pay for the description. Cognition says, never used, only heard about it. Also cautiously interested. Yeah. So when you partner with TideLift, you'll be working with us to provide the same kind of maintenance and assurance guarantees for your project that enterprise customers have traditionally expected from commercial software. So I think it sounds like things like security updates, right? Support, that sort of thing. Which, I mean, a big, machine learning, for better or worse, has a very strong open source ethos. It's been built on a lot of open source tooling. A lot of open source tooling has been built for machine learning. And the thing about open source is people aren't paid to do it. It is labor that is done for free. And in this case, there's sort of like a way for maintainers to get paid. I think things I like about it, I think people should be paid for their labor. I think companies should it's kind of a little bit against sort of the ethos of open source. Yeah. Folks are talking about Ukraine again. I'll leave y'all to it. It's sort of it's interesting because the thing about open source is it's very decentralized, it's very independent. And in this case, it sounds like you're now like working as a contractor for this company, Tidelift, and then they're working as like a go-between between companies that use these open source projects. And it's all very like voluntary on the case of for the companies that are paying, right? Because you don't have to pay for open source. That's the thing. That's what it is. And it sounds like there's a specific set of responsibilities that you need to say that, like, yes, I'm going to do this, and then you get paid for it. So like, you know, doing security, finding security vulnerabilities and maintenance and upgrades, resolve license conflicts, and also marketing. Like there's an expectation that you're going to do a certain amount of marketing, which is interesting. And then they get paid, which is good. Again, very happy to see people get paid for their work. I think people should be paid for work, but also it's kind of exactly the opposite of what open source is. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm interested. I want to see like how it works. And I should say that like some of the packages that have been lifted, that's what they call it, which also means like stolen. I don't think is what they mean in that context at all. Include like NumPy. We've all used NumPy. Pandas. We've all used pandas. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've used pandas. I've used NumPy. So yeah. Anyway. Yeah, let me know if you hear anything else about them. I'm interested in where this is going. A little bit. I mean, my worry here is that we all rely on open source, right? We all rely on open source maintainers. We all support and love them. Sometimes financially, right? So like you can support people on GitHub. They have a way of doing that. Potentially your company subscribes to this. But I guess my worry is that then maintainers might be in a situation where they have a conflict of interest. Like, should I do this thing that's going to be better for the community, or should I, you know, focus on what the Tidelift subscribers need, and perhaps they focus a little bit more on what the Tidelift subscribers need. I have no idea what the contracts look like or the terms or anything. So yeah, could potentially be very good for the community and provide like additional longevity to open source projects, or it could potentially be a source of friction and consolidation of power of the software tools we all need to do our work. Cognition says, I worry about a for-profit company stepping into the role of getting open source contributors paid, basically. Yeah, that's it, right? Like this could have been a nonprofit, but it's not. It's a company, I'm pretty sure. Oh, I think we're in the support section of them. But anyway, yeah. Let's see about our support. What is the scope of our support? Okay, so this report is only for their product specific thing, unless this means for the for bug and feature requests for open source packages. Anyway. Alexi says, I remember my butt was saved by some white hat hacker finding a vulnerability in one of our servers and informing us about it. Yeah, that's great. White hats are wonderful. Anyway, so we'll see. I like the idea on paper. I am imagining so many ways in which it goes horribly wrong, and I guess we'll see. And also whether or not open source maintainers should be paid at all has been a long running debate in open source. You can find a lot of information about it if you want to dig around online. This one, so there is a journalism fellowship ongoing where journalists are working on AI projects. And they need some help. So some of y'all might be interested in helping out here. These are the different projects that they're working on that they would like help on. So for example, this one, an AI-powered reporter that auto-creates development reports and data insights by transforming real-time data from satellite/web camera images, weather and socioeconomic data into news reports, data insights, and advisory that can be distributed directly to the newsroom and general audience. Yeah, so may potentially be a a good thing to reach out to. And if you want to, yes, I know, if you want to check any of these projects out, you can head over here and just sort of like reach out to folks directly. So yeah. All right. And I do have a couple jobs. I think I'm going to try and include, at least a couple places that are hiring that you may not have run across otherwise, because, times are getting a little bit tight. I don't know how many of y'all are on the job market, but, get the word out there. So Cortico, I have never heard about before. And I will say they are out of the, I think it's in there about, I think they're affiliated with the MIT Media Lab, yep, which is, it's a place. There are people who work there. How can I describe what my interactions with them have been like and the general vibe? It's interesting. Not always the most practical projects come out of here, so I'm just going to start with that. But, some interesting stuff, so maybe you're interested. And I think basically what they do is that they facilitate like group discussions and then do like automated annotation of the transcripts. That's my understanding. So could potentially be useful. And then they are hiring an engineering team lead and then a front-end engineer. So if you're interested in working with them, could be a cool project to work on possibly. Like I said, I'm not super familiar with the company, but they are hiring. Also hiring is, we've talked about them today, the Center for Democracy and Technology. Oh, I should say, I'm pretty sure these are based in the US, and I know for a fact these are based in the US. I don't know if they would take people in other places or not. Worthwhile reaching out to see. And they are hiring academic externs, a deputy director of privacy and data. So if any of you have experience there, might be a good thing to look on, and programs and operations associate. So I think a little bit less technical roles, but still in the technology space. So it might be of interest to some of you. Oh, and let me pop those links in here as well, so you don't have to go. How do they pay? No idea. No idea. I will say the Media Lab always seems to have money, has been my experience. Yeah, I also feel like they may have, I'm gonna double check something really quickly before I open my mouth and say anything. Yes, so one thing that did happen at the Media Lab relatively recently is that ties to Jeffrey Epstein, a political figure, I guess I'd call him, caused some researchers to quit. So I don't know how that's going to affect their funding in the future, but I don't know, something to keep in mind. Yeah, I would ask. Cognition says, you're going to just check Epstein because yes. Yeah, I was just double checking. Listen, sometimes I misremember, and particularly if something's like reflects negatively on an institution, I like to make sure that I'm not saying wrong things. But yep, so. All right, now on to politics. I'm going to warn you, this starts bad and continues to be bad for a little bit. So I don't know, open up your emergency gifs of kittens folders. Yeah, not ideal, Alexei. All right. So I realize this is a Daily Mail article, but I think they are the ones that had the scoop, perhaps, in English language. So currently and into the future, if you are a judge in China, you will receive a verdict from an AI system. And if you are going to disagree with that verdict, you need a written explanation as to why. So the default is the automated judgment. Something that I've said a lot is that I don't think we should automate high stakes decisions. And I think court cases are a great example of a high stakes decision. I would in no way recommend automating this at all. That said, I know that China isn't the only place that has considered doing this. I don't think they're currently doing this. This is from 2019, but Estonia also planned to use automated decision making during their court cases, which again, I would strongly recommend against as a practitioner. Oh, I got it. Not ideal. Yeah. Yep. So, again, not great, and it's happening. Speaking of China, I just happen to have a couple of things about China this week, coincidentally. So another thing that is a deployment of AI in China that, again, is not just a bad idea, but I would say is impossible, is there are systems that claim to be able to check the loyalty of party members, which is not a thing you can do. Right? So I've talked about this before. People's internal states and feelings are not accessible externally. And I think, we've all had experience with that. We go up to a friend and we're like, oh, you look so sad. What's wrong? And they're like, nothing's wrong. I'm just thinking. Anything that promises, anything that promises to detect thoughts, to detect internal states of human beings, if it's not like temperature and here's a thermometer, is false, right? They can't do that. What they can do is serve as a convenient automated scapegoat for decisions that you were going to make anyway, perhaps about detaining people. So not a great thing. And another one sorry, that is flashing. I'm gonna go back to the other one, so we're not looking at a flashing thing for a while. Yes, Robbie says, is fairness required for interpretability? No, interpretability is often used as a way to assess the fairness of systems. So interpretability is, can I understand what's happening? Fairness is, is this a good thing to happen considering the situation and context, I think is the broadest, the definition of fairness that I'm happiest. I'm just going to use that as a working definition for right now. Cognition says, yikes, yeah. Xplasher says, Chinese claims are always exaggerated or just lies in my experience. I mean, I don't live in China. I don't have access to these things firsthand, but I would definitely, I would say that this is not something that a system can do. And the fact that perhaps there is a system that claims to be able to do this potentially deployed is worrying for me as a practitioner. Yeah. Andre says, would I recommend studying the PyNLP module or not? I don't think I'm familiar with it, so I don't have any recommendation. Nine Gaming says, the news makes me think we're already living in a dystopia. Things could be better, and we can work together to make them better, and that's what I'll say on that. Alexi says there is some research with getting inside human heads, and Sricharan says, what if we tried chips and brains? What you're thinking about? Yeah, I mean, so we talked a little bit earlier. I don't know if y'all are here then or not, about variability in anatomy and biological variability. That includes things like processing. I'm sure Lexi, who has a background in neuroscience, is also familiar with this. So even something that we talk about in intro linguistics, like, oh, language is lateralized on the left side of the brain. Well, sometimes in some people, it's not a universal. The thumping and chewing sounds are my dog. Just to provide some context for that, the wonderful background sounds. I'm not going to take his toy away. He's having a great time. And potentially we could get to a place where those things tend to work most of the time for most people. I don't know that we need that or should do that. Yeah, I think we shouldn't do it, in fact. We'll talk a little bit later about a situation where biometrics completely failed an individual, and don't love it. Also very surveillance-y, or has a high potential for surveillance, and again, I don't like surveillance. Alexi says, the fact that you consider it a dystopia is a very good fact already. That's true. It's I don't know, something I think that engineers tend to share is that we imagine the future and the way that it could be, and I hope that we imagine it better than it is. Cognition says, even direct neural interfaces to this end would also require a massive leap in our understanding of brain activity that is hard to overstate. Yes. some individuals who have little to no actual understanding of machine learning and are constantly misleading folks about what systems can do, have made some claims about stuff that's just not possible. And I'll leave it at that. Y'all know who I'm talking about. I don't want that in my transcript. All right, there's going to be a little bit of flashing here, so I'll try and do what I can about it. What if I just zoom in really far? Is that going to make the flashing go away? There we go. All right, so we're not going to look down because there's quite a bit of flashing, and I don't want anyone who's sensitive to flashing to have any worries about it. Cognition says, no idea who you're referring to, relevant React. So this was wild, and this actually happened, I think, last week, but someone was using a word processor in China to write a novel, and it was censored before it was published through the word processing software. And apparently what happened was, so the company claims that the writing is all done locally, but I think she created a link to share the novel, and in creating the link to share it, it was then uploaded to the cloud and deleted potentially automatically. Hard to see, hard to say. Yeah, so locked out. I don't know if she was actually deleted, if the novel itself was deleted or not, but she couldn't interact with it anymore for allegedly including illegal content. So that is wild, and a degree of surveillance that I am deeply discomforted by. Yeah, there was also something sort of similar that some Google Docs users reported a while ago about copyright. See if I can find more details about that. I should have pulled that up, but it was a while ago. Anyway, there was something that some people are talking about, and I don't remember any more details, and I can't find a source on a quick search, so I guess my point is don't use internet-connected word processors if you are worried about potential censorship. Although, of course, I know that not everyone has choice in what software they use. So, Robbie says, you're the opposite. God, I hope so. Anyway, there are some people in this world that I thoroughly disapprove of as one individual looking at another individual. All right. And now talking about surveillance in the United States, just in case you thought this was all going to be about China, it sure won't. I'm going to make this a little bit less big on my end. So this is something we talked about. We've talked about this a bit off and on. So this idea of data brokers, right, who collect things like location data, information on individuals, and then sell it. We're selling data to the Department of Homeland Security. So that includes Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, as you may know them, who are even now doing human rights abuses. And one thing that the ACLU found, several liberties. I cannot, off the top of my head, remember what ACLU stands for. It is a word to me at this point. I can no longer decompose it. The American Civil Liberties Union, there we go, which is a human rights watchdog organization in the United States, found that they were just purchasing information. So ICE is a law enforcement agency, which means that if they want information about people, they should have to get a warrant, right? So if you want to do something like search somebody's house, you need to get a warrant. And they're using the ability to just buy data as a way to get around this constitutional protection that people have, and it's an issue. Oh, thank you, Cognition. Yeah, there's a little bit of a delay between me and the stream, so yeah. I think that anything that person said that he did single-handedly, he did not. just gonna put that out there. Has been my, at least certainly on the technical side, has been my impression. And I think this is I'll share this in the chat as well if y'all want to read this. A really good discussion by a number of people in the digital online privacy space, in the online and digital privacy space, about, you know, hey, we should do this something, legislature, please do this. And I will say, yes, absolutely. I think that this is something where legislative action should be taken. I think our constitutional rights are, in the US, we have a constitutional defense against, you know, undue search and seizure in the Fourth Amendment, which is not really being respected and protected at the moment, I would say. Certainly the spirit of the law is not being followed, if not the letter. But also, you know, again, as a technologist, data brokers are companies, and they are companies that hire engineers, and people are working on this, right? People are using their labor to do this and to violate the civil liberties of other people in their country. Well, I don't know where the data brokers are based, otherwheres. Yeah, so maybe if you've considered working for a data broker, think about the larger societal impacts of your work and maybe reconsider. And like, I understand, people got families to feed, people have got, you know, there are other considerations when finding work besides what is the most ethical thing I could do. But I think, you know, it's a climb, and some things are more ethical than others. Alexi says, I'm giving you a lot of homework today. I know. And I spent time editing too. I went through and like, yes, you're very cute. I removed a bunch of links. And I still ended up with a whole bunch of stuff, but things keep happening. It would be funny about that. Anyway, yeah, I think it's a good argument if you're in the US, something to contact your representatives about. And I didn't forget about Europe. The European Commission, which I believe is the legislative governing body of the European Union, has been sued for violating its own data protection rules. So yeah, this is happening, and it happened because they were transferring citizens' personal data from one of their websites to the United States. So and this has been ruled illegal by the EU Court of Justice 2 years ago in the landmark Schrems 2 or ill. I don't know what that's, I don't know how to say that, sorry. Ruling thus defining the interpretation in the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, good old GDPR, we know it, we love it. Because the American jurisdiction was deemed to have inadequate data protection. You don't say, you don't say. And U.S. intelligence and services could access the personal data of EU residents disproportionately and with no judicial remedy, which I would say also kind of happens to Americans. So, yeah. Sensei says, the engineering side of things is really interesting. Sometimes engineers don't know what their products are doing because those data firms outsource library work to the open source community via anonymous donations. Currently struggling with this at work. Yeah, it's hard. It definitely is. And that's, I think I said a while ago I was gonna make a video on this and straight up did not. But like, what should and shouldn't be open sourced? Because on the one hand, machine learning tools and natural language processing tools have really opened up a lot of new interesting things for people and have let people do things they couldn't do before and really helped a lot of people. And, you know, if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be in the field. But at the same time, the promise of machine learning and modern machine learning in particular is scale and speed and being able to do more things faster than we ever could before. And we are, you know, on the engineering side, having that ability long before civil society catches up, right? Like, we're still explaining what deepfakes are to congressmen, and they're currently defrauding, you know, heads of state or heads of city in the case of the mayor of Berlin. So yeah, I don't know. I mentioned that I'm studying to be for a personal trainer certification. Again, just wanted to do it. There is more discussion of duty of care towards clients in personal trainer certification than I have ever had in sort of professional training in engineering and computer science and machine learning and AI and NLP. So that's why I talk about these things. Yeah, it's complicated, it's hard, it's messy, it's already happening, but it's better to know about it and think about it than not, right? Cognition says say, don't so. Yep. Right, can you imagine, just as an example, right? Like, imagine trying not to use AWS for anything as a user and as a developer starting right now, right? Like, half web pages wouldn't load. Also, well, I guess we're back to the US. We briefly popped over to the EU. So the ADPPA, which I've talked about before, which is the big landmark US data privacy legislation, has kind of been on the rocks for a little bit, and maybe even more in the rocks. So I believe this week a new draft that carved out a greater protection for Californians was made available, or was produced, I guess. So this may be changing, but the Californians in the House of Representatives are not a big fan of it, because California already has a Privacy Protection Act, and the ADPPA would lessen protections. So the current working draft legislation in the House, and I mean, TBD whether or not it passes the Senate, that's in the US right now, that tends to be the blocker for a lot of things. But the struggle currently for the House is that the Californian representatives aren't a fan of it, because it means that Californians would be less protected than they are currently, even though most Americans would be more protected. So TBD what this looks like or what happens, but could potentially be in a little bit of trouble. Sensei says, I can't hardly explain what I do to my supervisor. I can't imagine explaining that to Congress. Yeah, it's difficult. Science and technical communication is a specialized skill that not everyone has. Cognition says, just log off the internet forever to avoid using AWS. We use Azure instead. And Sensei says, self-hosting is cool and fun, but the economy of scale really makes it unfeasible in the long run. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. And again, right, it's messy. People expect things to be on the internet. I expect things to be on the internet. And even if you're not using the internet, right, like maybe your car is and you have no control over that. Or maybe, you know, you go to the doctor's office and they have a little tablet to sign in, and whoops, accidentally it's giving information to Facebook in direct violation of HIPAA, like happened a couple weeks ago. Anyway. Speaking of law, so this was a good discussion from Margaret Mitchell, used to be at Google, currently at Hugging Face. Some of y'all may know her. She's a co-author on the Stochastics Parrots paper. Meg is great. Everybody loves Meg. Patently untrue. She's suffered a lot of harassment. I like Meg, let me put it that way. If you're familiar, last week we talked about Bloom, which was this really big multilingual language model, and it's released under a new license, the Rail license for the responsible use of AI. A good discussion that was had on Twitter was, you know, what about the text generated under the license, right? Because you can use embeddings to generate text. I think many of us probably know that. If you don't, you can do that. The discussion sort of continues. I'm going to check in with the chat really quick. Alexi says, okay, waiting for Web 3.0. Ooh, yeah. Speaking of harassment forever. Sorry, one of my biggest issues with Web 3.0 is you can't remove things. So if somebody doxes you, you are just doxed and you have no recourse. Sensei says, having my car connected to the internet sounds stupid. Just give me better public transport and I'll be happy. Yeah, that'd be great. I live in Richmond in Virginia, and we've actually made a pretty big investment in public transport, especially for, you know, a US city, which I'm very delighted with. We recently, sort of like the main east-west thoroughfare, just got dedicated bus lanes that are painted now, so you can see them really well, which is great, yeah. But yeah, a lot of cars are connected to the internet, and there's nothing that you can do about it as an owner. He's hungry. He thinks it's lunchtime. He's not wrong, but it's not for him quite yet. So anyway, discussion here. So from Meng's non-legal scholar understanding, content that is generated under another license remains under that license, which, you know, creates a lot of issues. Michael Veal responded, who I believe is a scholar of digital, associate professor of digital rights and regulations, clarifies that the license wouldn't pass on to the creations under that. Don't see how that could happen unless from the GPL case where the actual code is incorporated into other code, because the original license code is still identifiable within it. GPL is a pretty aggressive license. Copyright for the training set is unlikely to be held by Hugging Face. Very true. So a lot of Sorry, I don't know if you can hear him just whining. I'm ignoring him because we don't reward whining behavior. And he's sitting on my foot. A lot of the data used to train large language models is done, I don't want to necessarily say in direct violation of copyright, but usually without the consent of the copyright holders. TBD whether or not that constitutes fair use. I think it's still hashed out in being hashed out legally. Certainly data privacy and protection issues, though, which I've written about here. Here's a paper. And the UK regulator has published their guidance on model inversion as well. So I'll just post a link to this discussion in the chat in case you want to check it out. Congregation says, dog. Yeah, he's being rowdy today. Lexi says, it's rare to meet an American who can understand the very concept of public transport. You would be surprised. There are a lot of public transport activists in the US. We just have way less money than car companies, it turns out. But yeah, we're out here. Yeah. Oh, and the next one is my tweet. So speaking of the US, so there's, if you're not familiar with a geofence warrant is the police say, hey, we want, to know everyone who is in this specific place at this specific time, except generally it's not super specific. And, phone companies usually will be like, oh yeah, here's all the people who pinged off our tower. Part of the reason why, if you go to protests, some of the advice you might get sometimes is don't bring your phone. This is part of it. Keyword warrants. So this is a thing where the police ask Google, or presumably another search provider, to provide information on anyone who searched a specific keyword. And I did some digging and it found out that, oh yeah, it's a thing. And it has been a thing since at least 2019 that we know about publicly. And I'll post the link here so you can check that out if you're interested. Lexi says, your dog makes me hungry. He's right, it is lunchtime here in the East Coast of the US. You have all the money in the world to implement good infrastructure. But Lexi, how could we spend it on more fighter jets if we spent it on public infrastructure? Sensei says that's spooky. Yeah, it's horrifying. Again, speaking of, remember when we had a Fourth Amendment that meant anything? And so my general recommendation for you is, you see me using them a lot on stream. I really like Ecosia, and we'll talk about them a little bit later on as well. But one of the things I really like about them is their really good data privacy. So they do not store search information or personal profiles. They anonymize all searches within 1 week, right? So if somebody wanted that information, too bad, they couldn't get it on individuals. They don't sell their data, all searches are encrypted, they don't use external tracking, and they you can turn off tracking. I mean, they're a European company, so makes sense. So yeah, I really like their privacy policy. A couple other people reached out to me about other things, including, I did not write it down because I messed up. 1 second, let me see if I can get the name really quickly. But yeah, so I would, maybe recommend a different browser that doesn't just give your data to the police. Lexi says you could at least send the fighter jets to the Ukraine. Yeah. Cognition says, if we build a public transit network, then we won't have money for all those highway lanes we love. Yeah, very true. Fun fact about traffic, making highways wider does not reduce traffic. Because everyone's like, well, if extra highway, it's so big. We'll just use that. I'm trying to find... my own Mastodon is what I was looking at. Anyway, well, I can't find it. Maybe use a different browser. Not browser. I mean, maybe also don't use Chrome. Chrome also has a lot of surveillance in it. Anyway, IBM's fairness thing. Oh wait, I forgot to say what we're talking about. Ethics. So that's it for the politics section. Now for ethics. So we've talked actually a little bit today about different measures of fairness. Once upon a time, several years ago, Alexi says, you know nothing about police breaking people's privacy if you haven't lived in Russia. Yeah, I do imagine it's worse. But it would be good if it didn't happen anywhere, right? At all. Would be my preference. So we've talked a little bit about fairness and different measures of fairness. And IBM has open sourced a PyTorch package this week to train and audit machine learning models for individual fairness. And individual fairness is a fairness. Let me take a little drink of water. And try again to say the words right and not wrong words that don't exist. A model of individual fairness. So individual fairness is a measure of fairness where if I took a person and I compare them to a counterfactual person that was part of a different social group, I should get the same output for both of those people, right? So if I, let's say here's Rachel, I'm a woman, we have imaginary counterfactual Rachel who's a man. If real Rachel gets a job offer at a certain salary, counterfactual Rachel who's a man should get the same job offer at the same salary, for example. Dano says, as someone who doesn't own a car, I constantly have to remind Texans that me not being on the road is a benefit to them, but I still get socially ostracized for my pro-public transit stance. Yeah, yeah, there is a lot tied up with car ownership in the United States, right? There's this sort of, it has a very particular cultural meaning and value. Having your own car is really associated with freedom. It's really associated with like individual autonomy, being able to go places. If you live in Texas, if you live in the US, you're probably very aware there's many places where you can't get places on foot. So having a car lets you do anything, right? Or like, I lived on a farm in high school, and without a car, I couldn't go anywhere. I was so far away from stuff. And mostly I just didn't go anywhere, right? Which, it wasn't great for me. It was not ideal to just be isolated in a very rural area, like isolated. But anyway, so, if you aren't in favor of cars, you're often seen as being opposed to those values that people have that they associate with car ownership, like autonomy and independence and, freedom, basically, which in a very practical way they are. But if things were different, you could have that same autonomy and freedom in a different way. So yeah, I get it. I understand that there's like a strong emotional component there. But yes, I'm also not, I think we're all going to need to do, and by we, I mean Americans, a lot less car using and a lot less, individual vehicle using overall. Anyway, individual fairness. So this might be potentially useful for some of y'all. I will say that individual fairness is not my personal favorite measure of fairness. And I think this sort of position paper is a really good summarization of some of the issues with that. Nine Gaming says, who gets to decide about ethics? Doesn't it depend on culture? Great question. Yes, absolutely. Ethics is cultural, ethics is localized, ethics is personal. Which is why, a big part of the reason why I think having a single measure and being like, look, I made the number go up, therefore this model is more fair, therefore this model is more ethical, is kind of a dangerous way of thinking about things, right? And if you have, a number that you can make go up, you can build a system whose very existence is harmful, we'll come to an example in just a little bit. You can have a system whose very existence is harmful, but could have, well, it's super fair according to this fairness measure, therefore it's ethical, right? So I think there's this danger of using a numeric measure, using a quantifiable thing to try and get around having to think about things that aren't quantifiable because it's just easier. And I get it, it is easier. But I think that the big risk there is that perverse metrics, right? You get really focused on something and you spend your time and energy on that, and you don't step back and be like, is this something we should build at all, right? Like, oh, this data broker is super fair, but also, they hurt people by, selling stalkers data on their victim, for example. So, yeah. Anyway, so individual fairness, some specific issues with it. So, for example, the insufficiency of similar treatment suggests the individual fairness method should not be in isolation from other fairness methods, right? So if this is true of a system, right, that the same person with one quality different has the same outcome as a person who has that quality the same, assuming that's not a quality you want to have an effect on the judgment, that may be a desirable quality of the system. Like, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad that you have, a high measure of individual fairness, right? But if I'm like, hey, I have this candidate, right? And I've created this counterfactual candidate, and both the candidate and the counterfactual candidate were on the men's lacrosse team, but I've said that, oh, this counterfactual candidate is a woman, right? Like, setting aside, hearkening back to our discussion of gender earlier, like perhaps that is relevant, perhaps that is important that you have both those pieces of information for this counterfactual candidate. You still have the latent variable of having, or the leakage of having been at one point on a men's sports team, right? So anyway, this may be a helpful tool for people. I would not say you can just plug this in and suddenly everything is fair. Which I don't know. I hope that no one's under that impression, but I think that, you're in a rush. Someone's like, well, is your model fair? I can understand how you might end up doing that. And I think it's just important to think about the larger context when you make decisions like that. Speaking of larger context, let me, Cognition says, do you want to build a utility monster? Because that's how you get a utility monster. And Sensei says, it sounds almost like a social credit score. Sounds familiar. Alexi says, I managed to survive my 30s without ever owning a car. Maybe the countries I live in gave any care at all to public transportation. Yeah. I mean, I think there's places in the US where you could live without a car, but yeah, I think it's good for us to advocate for people to be able to get around without cars. I mean, very practically, the US population is aging very rapidly, and not having to drive but still be able to get around and do stuff will make, older folks' lives a lot more richer and easier. Ugh. All right, speaking of things, so Meta, a company that owns Facebook, has released their first annual human rights report where they give themselves a big pat on the back for being great and shift all the blame onto users. And the particular thing that they talk about that people are most unamused about is their covering of human rights abuses in India specifically. So the report, they I believe they actually commissioned it from like a think tank or something. Like, Facebook didn't do the report itself, but Facebook did definitely write the marketing for the report. And you can see this is a Times article. Facebook is accused of whitewashing long-awaited human rights report on India, right? So basically the report says like, oh, Facebook's fine. It's all good. Nothing to see here. Yeah, some users aren't very good, but users, what can you do? I'm being a little bit facetious. They did not quite say that. But that's sort of the general vibe. Yeah, so there have been, quite a few things going on. I'm sure those of you who are more familiar with India are very aware of this, but some context. So India is the country where the largest group of Facebook users live, and the most senior executive in India resigned a couple of years ago because it turns out that they had been intervening and removing accounts from, the nationalist ruling party, including those that called for violence. Calling for violence is against Facebook's terms of use, but, they were allowed to do it because this executive intervened, and so on and so forth. So basically, human rights agencies have been really pointing out to Facebook the number of ways in which it is enabling human rights abuses, and this report is sort of like Facebook's, the study was conducted independently, is my understanding, and this is Facebook releasing that information. It's very short, and it seems to really downplay the role of the platform in these things. So Cognition says, we've investigated ourselves and found we did awesome. Yeah. So like I said, I believe the report itself was independently written, but this sort of discussion of it is, I believe, done through Facebook. And I'm pretty sure it went through their PR departments, etc. So it really does not seem to be it doesn't seem to align with the research and understanding of human rights organizations on the matter. Let me put it that way. Yeah. Dano says, it's sad that most of the Vision Zero and research funding goes to making safer roads instead of encouraging public transportation. Yep. So Vision Zero is a program in the US to reduce traffic fatalities to zero. Traffic fatalities are a very common cause of death in the United States because a lot of people drive here. Yeah. Getting people onto public transport instead of driving individually is a great way to reduce traffic fatalities, but it's not the priority of a lot of these programs. Alexi saying that public transit in Seoul is great. That's what I've heard. I've heard it's really good. Yeah, so it was carried out by an independent law firm, Foley Hoag. Yeah, I hear you, bud. Which interviewed more than 40 civil society stakeholders, activists, and journalists to complete the report. But Facebook drew criticism from rights groups on Thursday after it released its own 4-page summary of the law firm's findings that was almost bereft of any meaningful details. And then there's an opinion piece here from 2 senior researchers from the Human Rights Watch, and I'll link that as well in case you want to check it out. That talked about it as well. Robbie says, now people are aware about data privacy here in India. That's fabulous. Yeah, I know we've talked a little bit about different ways in which data privacy is coming up in India. We talked about some of the state biometric stuff and how that might potentially be an issue. And actually, one of the things that I ended up cutting and we didn't talk about, because I was like, this isn't really machine learning or language technology, is a program for a public assistance program that employs people in rural areas, but in order to make sure people are doing the work, they were like, oh, we'll use their phone location to figure out what they are, make sure where they should be doing the work, but the app doesn't work, and as a result, a lot of people aren't being paid for their work. So yeah. Yeah. Anyway, and I would expect more sort of discussion about this from human rights organizations and digital rights organizations as time goes on. Also, on sort of the ethics side, so we talked a while ago about how Instagram was removing any offer of any discussion of abortion pills or offers to send people abortion pills, which again is legal in the US, but was not removing similarly worded offers to send people guns or marijuana. Sending people guns is not legal in the US, and marijuana remains illegal at a federal level. But those stayed up even though they were against Facebook's. Sorry, he's being loud. Even though they were against Facebook's terms of use. And this is a article about how Facebook is now serving ads that contain medical misinformation. So I'm not going to say it's disinformation. I think that the people who are serving the ads may believe it. But basically, there's a procedure where you use medication for an abortion, where you take one pill and then you wait a while and you take another pill. And the ads claim that after you take the first pill, the process can be reversed if you take a different pill. And the medical research on that process was actually stopped because it proved to be so dangerous to participants' health. Like multiple people had to be hospitalized for hemorrhaging. The researchers decided it was unethical to continue. It was far too risky. So the ads are recommending that people do this thing that in the medical studies was so dangerous to their lives that the studies had to be stopped. Anyway, and Facebook is allowing these ads. And it sounds like some of the ads have been up for quite a while, but obviously they're being served more now because there's more discussion of this topic on Facebook. Anyway, Meta is now considered to be an extremist organization in Russia, so displaying the logo of Facebook or Instagram can theoretically put you in prison for up to 8 years. Wow. Robbie says, I think he's getting angry, my dog. Yeah, I think he's getting a little bit like, where's lunch? Yeah, so no good. No good at all. And Amazon, Sensei says, this makes me mad. Leave medical advice to doctors, not advertisers. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I will say something that some of you may not be aware of. It is legal to advertise to consumers prescription medication in the United States. So if you're watching TV, you'll see an ad that's like, do you have multiple sclerosis? This prescription medication can handle these types of symptoms and has these side effects. Talk to your doctor, which to my understanding is kind of just a US thing. I think most places you can't do that. But yeah, prescription drug companies do advertise here in the United States. So it's not as wild as it seems in context to be discussing medication in an advertisement. But I agree, they shouldn't be doing it. Yeah. Alexi says, where's lunch? Yeah, not yet made. And I think we've talked about this before. We knew that they were, well, I shouldn't say that. I think it's in sort of data privacy circles kind of common knowledge that Amazon does this. So basically police can say like, hey, Amazon, we want Ring doorbell data. So Ring are doorbells that record stuff, right? So if you live in a neighborhood in the United States, probably some of your neighbors have Rings, which means that your comings and goings have been recorded. And it sounds like cops can just ask for it without a warrant or user consent and just get it. And they have done it at least 11 times so far in 2022, and I imagine probably more. So I would personally recommend not using Rings and encouraging other people in your life not to use them either. They are a huge privacy and security risk. Please don't do it. That's my professional recommendation as a language technologist. Is that language? Machine learning technologist. Cognition says, it was such an eye-opening moment when I learned that it's not normal elsewhere. Yeah. Alexi says, America's a very wild place. Yeah, it is. But it's home. The prescription advertising. Yeah, I know what you meant. Speaking of studies that should never have been done. So some of you, if any of you have seen my talk from, I want to say it was the 2019 or 2020 Women in Machine Learning workshop, where I talked about what I won't build and sort of like my own ethical framework for building language technology. One of the things that I don't build is social category detectors anymore. And at one point I did, and at one point I thought it was a good thing to do. And now I think that that's wrong and I wouldn't do it anymore, which is where you attempt to assign an individual into a social group. So this is a thing like a gender detector, right? Like I just wouldn't do it. And in this case, the social group in question is one that is particularly sensitive right now. So this was a paper that was published, and I'm not going to show the name of the paper. You can find it if you really want to, but I don't think people should be reading it. So, LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, just in general, queer people have privacy concerns. So they might be reluctant to participate in research. So we built a machine learning classifier to identify them on Twitter so they can be researched anyway. And this has, I would say, clear privacy and safety implications for LGBT people generally. So in some places in the United States, it is illegal to be gay. basically, those laws are not currently enforced, but they could be at some point in the future. Also, you may be familiar with the sort of growing rise in legislation and hate crimes against trans people in particular, or that targets trans people in particular. So right now, I would say that that population in the United States is in, pretty big danger, and you would not want to, I imagine, would not want to be, identified as such. Especially without their consent or their will, right? Or their knowledge. So I don't know, will is not the right word there. And, that's just in the US context, but in other contexts, there are countries where it is punishable by death to be queer. So that is a huge safety worry for people. To speak of Russia, there's a WNBA player, Jessica Greyer. It's a name I've only ever read, so apologies. I have read visually, so apologies if I have it wrong, who is currently detained in Russia indefinitely for basically being a lesbian. So very potentially harmful to identify people as being part of this community. Lots of reasons why they wouldn't want to be publicly known as being part of that community for their own safety. So the ethical considerations in the paper is the data is public, right? To which I would say there's a big difference between data being public and findable and it being categorized and searchable more particularly, right? So, something being available in a public records, if I make a public record request, is very different from that being available if I just Google something, right? Like one of those things is, a lot less obscure than the other, to borrow some security terminology. So this one is incorrect. Their IRB did not approve it. The Institutional Review Board is a board that reviews research for ethical considerations. In this case, it was not approved, but it was exempt. So the IRB was not involved here. We are not disclosing PII, personally identifiable information, but they did create a system which attempts to infer PII. And we have co-authors who identify as LGBT. And I would say, if you're not familiar with the idea of tokenism, it's the idea that someone who is a member of a marginalized group represents all people in that group, right? So like, oh, Rachel, you're a woman in tech. You know what every woman in tech's experience is like, right? You can speak for everybody in that group, right? Well, I can't. Being expected to, I think, is... even if there are people who would be like happy to do that, I think that it's not good consideration to have like, one person or a few people from that group who agree to it to use that as evidence that it's fine. The stated goal is isolating accounts from queer individuals as opposed to organizations for the purposes of public health research. The classifier's three categories for LGBT accounts are individuals, organizations, and sex workers / porn, which not treating sex workers as individuals is a choice in and of itself. Yeah. Oh no, Cognition said, speaking about Ring doorbells, I had an apartment neighbor a while back whose Ring doorbell pointed straight at my front door right across this hall. Hated it. Depending on your state, there may be state laws against that. If you are, again, depending on your state, I would check the state laws, but being recorded without your explicit permission can be grounds to take down a camera doorbell like that. I'd double check. Cognition says, just because the data is public doesn't mean you should compile and operationalize it and explain exactly how others can do exactly the same. Yeah, precisely. 100%. Dano says, yikes, outing people, whether true or false, is very big yikesy. Absolutely, 100%. Outing, so in the queer community, if you are open about being part of that community, you're said to be out. If you're not, you're said to be closeted. So outing someone is telling someone else without that person's knowledge or permission that, hey, oh yeah, she's a queer lady, or like, oh yeah, you didn't know he's trans, that sort of thing. And again, it can be very dangerous, can be very harmful. Yeah, and just because the IRB approved something, it doesn't make it ethical. Yeah, and in this case, it was an IRB approved, and I would hope that an IRB would not approve this. And Alexia says, I wonder why the LGBTQ plus people rights exists. Rights in Russia Wikipedia page exists because those rights don't really exist in Russia. Yeah, definitely something I'm a lot on my mind recently. I got a lot on my mind at all times. I don't know. I know things can be kind of heavy, which is why I always end with a nice little uplifting fun section. Life should not always be dreary and awful, even when things are challenging. Casey continues. Also, Casey is really, really cool. Recommend following her on Twitter. She is at, I think, Colorado University, Information Science, used to be at GT, Tech, Ethics, Law, Internet, Fandom, etc. So, a good Twitter account to follow. I recommend it. I make this clarification because I realize it could be worse than it is. Their data set is based on Twitter accounts with LGBT keywords in profiles. So regardless, I think the narrative is problematic, but it's not a classifier intended to out people. Necessarily. So I think it could actually out people, particularly if it ended up... So something that some people will have is multiple Twitter accounts for different areas of their life. And if you had, you know, your Twitter account for hanging out with friends and posting memes and jokes and stuff, and you were out on that account, but then you had another professional Twitter account and you were not out on that account, let's say you were included in this data set, and someone looked through it and was like, oh, hey, I know them. I didn't know that they were queer. I think it could end up outing people, even if that's not the intention. I think it's a very real risk. And Casey said, I think it's important to acknowledge that this exact same kind of data set could be used to do exactly that. The reason I highlight examples like this is because I think it's important for people to realize what's possible and how few ethical guardrails there are. Absolutely. Us holding each other accountable is really the #1 thing right now. Legislation is not caught up. Even if it has, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be sufficient or good. So yeah, don't do this. If you hear somebody thinking about doing this, encourage them not to. And even if, you know, you as a researcher think that, hey, you know, I think the potential goods of this definitely outweigh the potential harms, it's important to double check that assumption, right? So if you had, just an example, if you had a language identifier that identified tweets based on whether or not they were in Uyghur, that could potentially be very harmful to individuals, right? Or whether or not you use, you know, code switching into Uyghur. So, yeah, be mindful, be paranoid, be super paranoid on behalf of your users at all times, because I think that's the, you know, when we build technology for people to use, I think that we take on, not legally, but I do think that, you know, morally and ethically, we take on a burden of care towards those people and should do our very best to safeguard them and make sure they do okay. Oh, great question, Robbie. So LGBTQ, we talked about LGBT is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, or transgender. Transsexual is not a term that people use anymore. Queer plus means other folks. So sometimes you'll also see A included for asexual or I included for intersex. So actually we talked earlier about, you know, genomes. So people who, you know, have, let's say, primary sexual characteristics of multiple sexes would be intersex. Yeah. Yeah, no worries. Good question. All right. And then, whoop, just gonna scooch that down so we can see better. This is sort of interesting. So France is going to start requiring PhDs to take a research ethics oath, which I think is something that, I don't know, maybe if you'd taken an oath and really thought about it, you'd maybe think about this a second time. I hope so. I don't know. I mean, I have done projects like this very similar in the past, and I thought that they were fine to do at the time, and I no longer think so. So I hope the authors of this study have a chance to really think about it and choose not to do similar things in the future. So, yeah, so I think that's sort of interesting. And this, I'll actually pop in the chat. So this was part of the Internet Health Report, but there is a yeah, be careful, Lexi. The report included some podcast episodes, including this one on the tech we won't build. So I know if you've been listening to me for a couple hours now, I have a lot of ideas about what I won't build, but I think it's also really valuable to get a lot of perspectives around this. So this is a really cool podcast that has a lot of discussion of different people deciding what not to build. Including the founder of the Data for Black Lives project, which I think is really cool. And yeah, so I'd recommend listening to it, checking it out, and a good way to sort of, I mean, not just listen to me. I mean, I think I'm fine, but yeah, good to get diverse perspectives, right? All right, we're on to the fun miscellaneous. Whew, little palate cleanser. Gonna take a drink. I did a vocal warm-up today before stream, and I think it helped. I don't know why it didn't occur to me beforehand. I know about them, I just didn't think to do them. All right. Sensei says, sound like they're trying to do something similar to the Hippocratic Oath for the research field about the France requiring research ethics oath. Yeah, I think that's the intention. The Hippocratic Oath, if any of you aren't familiar, is the oath that doctors take to do no harm before being a doctor. Yeah, which, I don't know, I think it makes sense. I believe in ethics, and I believe in people, and I think most of us want to do the right thing, and yeah, I think symbols can be really powerful and really helpful. All right. Oh, TJ left. TJ was in the chat earlier. Anyway, I believe he was T-Rex. I have shared one of his memes. So he was a statistician, so this is very much a joke. But, you know, statistics is fake. Logarithms were invented to avoid multiplication. Do you think an average should grow exponentially? No, duh. Obviously, statistics is fake. Poisson is French for fish. Fish are not numbers. This just made me chuckle, and I think some of you will probably enjoy it as well. So yeah, as we all know, statistics is fake, not a real field. Don't do statistics, kids. Not even once. I'm obviously a joke. I have done a lot of statistics. I think it's very worthwhile and valuable, but yes, sometimes it can be a little silly. Oh good, glad to hear that, Alexi. Early during quarantine, in 2020, I dropped my glasses off the balcony I had like a window box on a balcony rail, and I was looking down at my plants, and they went whoop onto the ground below, many stories down, and they were unharmed. But after that, I decided to purchase additional glasses because I was very scared of breaking my only pair of glasses, like that one person in that Twilight Zone sketch. Oh, and this is fabulous. So Janelle Shane, I think, who I don't know why I keep wanting to say it Shanae, there's no accent there, does AI weirdness, which y'all have probably seen her if you follow people on AI Twitter. She does a bunch of really fun stuff. But I think this is a really good example about when we talk about generated language content not being grounded, right? Like it has the form of the real thing, but not the function, right? So if you generated like a waiver using, a legal waiver using, GPT-3, you'd get something that probably looked like a waiver, but may not actually serve as a waiver legally because of the way that things are phrased, because legal language is very precise. Just as an example, and I think this is a really good visceral example. If you're not familiar with Magic Eye, I think it was more popular in the 90s, or at least that's when I remember seeing it more. But the idea is that if you can use a trick of your binocular vision. I'm not a vision person, I don't exactly know what it's working, but if you sort of look at it in the right way and cross your eyes and uncross your eyes, it'll pop out and it'll have the illusion of a 3D image popping out of a background. And if you move back and forth, it'll sort of move back and forth. I think it has something to do with stereoscopic imaging, binocular vision. Not a computer or human vision person. Do not quote me on that. But anyway, they sort of look like this, but these are not magic eyes, right? So at the pixel level, yeah, good job, you did it, but it does not actually have the effect that magic eyes should have. So I think just a really good example of what you can't do with generative systems. Yes. Okay. And I know this starts bad, but it's going to get better. I mentioned Ecosia again. I think, great example of a tech company that's really being thoughtful and forward focused and centering the greater good. And like, things are bad in Europe right now. And y'all know that. But these are some like concrete things that they're doing. So one of the things that, I don't know about y'all, but I certainly have some anxiety around climate change. And one of the things that I do is really focus on the concrete actions that I can take currently. And here are some concrete actions that Ecosia is taking. So in southern France, Ecosia is helping the firefighters plant native trees that are fire resistant outside Marseille. So it'll protect biodiversity. It should make the area, just nicer to be in all around. They've done similar stuff in Brazil. They've done a lot of work helping out to preserve and protect trees all across the world. There's this concept in sort of ecological activism called greenwashing, which is where a company is like, oh yes, we plant 1 tree for every bracelet sold or something like that. Some of those are scams. Some of those are, not actually beneficial to the environment in any way, even though the trees do get planted. But Ecosia, I have looked in quite a bit. I do not believe they are greenwashing. They are helping. So they've done a lot of stuff, and they've also been planting trees in cities, focusing on disadvantaged areas with low tree cover. During a heat wave, trees cool down neighborhoods by up to 8 degrees C by providing shade and bringing moisture back into the air. So if you've heard about the idea of heat islands, it's the idea that cities, particularly downtowns, tend to be hotter than surrounding areas because of the asphalt and the glass. They sort of trap and increase the amount of heat that's available. So adding trees helps to reduce that effect, and they're really focusing on, neighborhoods that are not as resourced. So yeah, folks are helping. We're doing what we can. Certainly something that I think about in my day-to-day life. And finally, I have, whose channel is this? A second example of a computer vision project that I think is actually cool. And this is, some of you may have played around with this, NVIDIA Canvas. Robbie says, have you ever heard about carbon markets? I have. I believe that my understanding from the current research, I'm not an environmental scientist or environmental scientist. I don't work in the field, but I do read papers in it occasionally, is that carbon markets don't overall actually really help, unfortunately. And things like cap and trade don't actually help reduce emissions overall, because they don't change behavior. Yep. Anyway, it's especially relevant right now in Virginia because our electricity prices have risen currently quite a bit due to fluctuations in oil and gas prices. So NVIDIA Canvas. Devon, welcome. Oh, no worries. This is actually the very last thing we're going to talk about, but I'm glad you joined for a little bit. Good to see you. I'm so sorry to hear that. Alexei says, in my home regions of Yakutia, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, there are fierce wildfires. Nobody cares. That really stinks. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope that they are under control and that nobody gets hurt. So basically the way it works is, I don't have it downloaded or anything, but you have brushes that are like, I want grass here, or I want water here, or I want sky here, and you use them to draw the silhouettes of the shapes that you want in a landscape. And the AI fills them in, basically. So you can create custom landscapes for various purposes. And the reason that I think this is such a good project is very constrained use. It is for landscapes. It will only make landscape images. So you know what people are going to do with it. I'm not going to say that it is impossible to create inappropriate content with this tool. I've been on the internet too long to say that. However, I do think that, the harm of these pieces of content is pretty low. And in terms of being like a cool, fun toy, pretty high. Also, computer vision systems tend not to be super good at silhouettes. So this offloads the part that's difficult for computer vision systems, silhouettes, into humans, and then uses the computer vision systems for the infill, and making the pixels look right, which I think is cool. I think that's a good use of computer vision. So yeah, and I can imagine uses for this for like, you know, making backgrounds for web comics, or if you wanted like a cool lock screen for your phone, or if you wanted, you know, if you were doing a role-playing game and you wanted to create, you know, custom landscapes and be like, oh, you're in, you know, the beautiful mountains of West Fantasyland and this is what it looks like. So yeah, I think just overall cool project, very limited scope. I like limited scope projects with narrow focus. And yeah, good job, NVIDIA. So yeah, NVIDIA Canvas is the name of the tool, correct? All right, so a mere almost 3 hours later, we're about ready to wrap it up. We talked about a lot today, and yeah, hopefully ended on a little bit of a high note. And before I head out, I want to make sure that I thank all my coffee supporters, my monthly coffee supporters. So I mentioned this before, I'm trying to do this as my full-time job, and these folks are making me make progress towards that goal. So thank you all very, very much. If you would also like to support me, my coffee is RCTATMAN, like I am everywhere else. Yeah, also, if you are in the coffee chat, no, sorry, the chit chat tier, I just posted yesterday the time for that. So for you to join, so go and check the coffee if you are looking for that. And if you're in the links please tier, the links are already up for this one. Haha, I did it ahead of time. Good job, Rachel. So thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate you. Oh, yeah, you're very welcome, Docking. And thank you everyone for joining today. I hope this was, I mean, definitely some not great stuff, but also some good stuff. And yeah, remember we make the future and we can make it together and we can make it better. And I believe in us. All right. Thanks so much for joining today, everybody. I hope you have a great day. Stay cool, stay healthy, stay safe, do the best you can. And I will talk to you later. Bye.